take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please welcome to the stage Lauren Keel, General Manager of Bloomberg Green.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see all of you. Grab your seats. Come on in. We're going to get started. We're so excited to have you with us here for our first Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit in Asia. Thrilled to have all of you filling the room here today. And for the many people who are watching us virtually as well, welcome to you. I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking our sponsors for today's event. Our founding sponsor is DBS Bank, and our presenting sponsor is RGE. Thank you to both for making today possible. A couple of housekeeping notes to make sure that you have the best day possible with us. So if you're joining us virtually, make sure that you're using Firefox or Chrome. Those are the best browsers to access this. If you're having any issues, just try the old refresh, see if that works. If it doesn't, there is an event chat box on the bottom right corner. You can message us for some support. We'll have someone get back to you and help you out. If you're here in the room or if you're joining us virtually, we want to hear from you. So we're going to be hearing from lots of great speakers up on this stage today. But we also want your voices to be heard. So if you're here with us, grab your badge, take a look at the QR code on it, scan that QR code, and you can submit questions for our speakers throughout the day. They want to hear from you. Our moderators are going to be incorporating them into their questions. So please go ahead and get those questions in early. If you're joining us virtually, there is a white tab on the bottom right side of your video window. Same thing there. You can input your questions. Our moderators are going to ask them throughout the day. So please start sending those questions in now. We also would love to hear from you on social media. So regardless of what platform you're using, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, we're on all of them. Please engage with us using hashtag #SustainableBizSummit. You can see it on the screen behind me here. Would love to hear what you have to say about our programming throughout the day. And with that, we're going to get started. So for our first conversation of the day, I would like to welcome to join me on stage Piyush Gupta, the CEO of DBS Bank.
Hi, morning, Lauren.
Thanks for helping us kick off the morning here today.
Very happy to. When did you get in last night?
I was here a couple days ago,
Okay,
so I've
so
had a bit of time to acclimate.
Then we can have a good conversation.
We'll have a great one. So I want to start by talking to you about the topic for this event. It's the Sustainable Business Summit. And so for you, what does it actually mean to be a sustainable business?
The Brundtland report, I think it was late 80s, 1987 perhaps, they first came up with this concept of sustainable development. And if I remember, I'm paraphrasing it, they effectively said that the definition of sustainable development, the way they defined it, is to be able to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. And that's basically the most pithy way of describing it. And I think they nailed it, because that's what sustainability is. How do you make a business or a country or an economy work in a way that you meet the needs of the present generation, which are economic, developmental, etc., but at the same time have an eye for a much longer term future? How do you look after generation 2, 3, 4, 5 after that? It's interesting that for the longest time, at least my thinking around it used to be around the S, which is now being called ESG, the social agenda around this. Because to a large extent, I thought a lot about the social equity problem. How do you make sure that you satisfy developmental agendas today, but at the same time you're building for a longer-term social thing, education, healthcare, systems of taking people out of economic development and out of the poverty trap. But one of the things that's evolved, and particularly in the last 10, 20 years, frankly after COP21 in 2016, is the recognition that actually some of the biggest challenges we have are environmental challenges. So how do you make sure that the Earth, the planet itself, is sustainable, is there for future generations, leave alone the economic development agenda for people? I like the way Kate Raworth from Oxford actually frames it. She's got this whole concept of donut economics. It's simple, but the idea, if you take the 17 SDGs, you'll find a chunk of them, a number of them are around planetary boundaries. So ozone in the air, the amount of pollutants, etc. So there are 9 planetary boundaries. And the recognition is that for us to be able to keep the Earth itself, the planet, sustainable, over time we've got to live within the constraints of those 9 planetary boundaries. So many of the SDGs relate to those. But at the same time, she defines that as a ring. At the same time, she also defines an inside ring. And the inside ring she defines as the economic consideration. So hunger, poverty, development, etc. And her basic theory is that as we develop, we've got to see how we stay inside the outside ring, but outside the inside ring. So we've got to make sure we're above the floors of economic development. And to me, that's the best way to think about what we're trying to do. Make sure that we create a future for people, the bottom of the pyramid today, the bottom of the pyramid tomorrow, but stay within the confines of the planetary boundaries that are material.
And you've been in this role since 2009. I can only imagine that in that time, your thinking on this topic has evolved, and the expectations you're feeling in your role to be focusing on ESG and sustainability and the back and forth debates on how much the value of each of those things are. Tell us a little bit more about how is this evolved as part of your day-to-day work?
Yeah. So I'll go back to, the social agenda is not only something I thought about, but that's been very fundamental to DBS for the longest time. We were created as a company in the late 60s to help with the development of Singapore. And in the late 90s, we were merged with POSB, which was a savings bank. So, this idea of neighbors first, bankers second, that's the tagline. That was in our DNA. And so for the longest time, this idea of being sustainable, i.e. being relevant to society, doing real things for real people, and therefore having a purpose, that's been deeply rooted in our DNA. And therefore I sometimes tell people, we are bankers to like 5 million people. Everybody in this country has a DBS, POSB account. Few people realize that 3.5 million of those people don't make any money for us. We lose money on them. So if we were just focused on the short-term agenda around shareholder value creation, we'd basically not bank them. But we know we have a different role. We're the people's bank. And so you have to be part of this, because how do you get those people out of the poverty trap? How do you give them a future? How do you give them the opportunity to build a new life? So that's always been deeply ingrained in our DNA. What has shifted and evolved? Shifted is a strong word. I've been an environmentalist since I was young, as a keen bird watcher. But what has evolved in the last few years is the focus on the environmental agenda, and particularly the climate agenda. Even now, biodiversity is less of a subject on the radar, but the climate agenda has really picked up steam in the last few years. And therefore, starting thinking about the role that companies like us have in terms of addressing the climate challenges and transitioning the world to a less carbon-intensive business model, that's occupied front and center space in our thinking in the last 6-7 years. And that's caused us to step up our game. We've now got a board sustainability committee. We created a position called Chief Sustainability Officer. We didn't have that. We focused a lot on creating a complete overarching program for a sustainability agenda, including a large focus on our own business activities, what we do with our customers. So our capital raising activities, our financial inclusion activities, our transition, our products that we offer, all of this is relatively new last 5-6 years. I hasten to add, even though we started 5-6 years ago, I think we made a lot of progress. Today we're regarded as one of the leaders in the world in the space. But I'll be very honest, it wasn't on the agenda 10 years ago.
And as you're talking about how much that's changed over the last 6 years or so, especially around climate pressure, has the pressure around that change come from your customers, come from investors? Is it coming from government? Where are you feeling that pressure to make those changes?
Well, maybe I'm being too politically correct. I wouldn't call it pressure. I would call it motivation.
Encouragement.
But I think most of the motivation originally came from investors first, customers. So a lot of customers are beginning to look for green solutions, and surprisingly from employees. So the young kids that we were hiring were increasingly wanting to know what was our role, what could we do, and how could we make a difference. And we started realizing that our employee value proposition gets strengthened a lot if you have a legitimate and a meaningful agenda around this stuff. But I would say investors were probably primary in terms of focusing our mind around what needed to be done. In truth, many of the governments in our part of the world have been latecomers to the game, right? And so it was not driven through regulation or policy action, and that's in most of the countries where we operate in Asia. I think that's understandable because the starting position for many countries in our region is that the economic development challenges are still paramount. And therefore, the planetary challenges have not been that important to them. But if you ask me the question the other way around, so what drives the process going forward, I think it has to be government, regulation, and policy agenda. Because if you really want a change at pace, it's got to be supported by policy. Otherwise, we'll not get that kind of change. The reality is that investors and consumers, with the best of intent and mind, can be fickle. So they move around in cycles in terms of what it is that they're seeking. And I was mentioning outside, the FT article yesterday on the investor approach to this in the last year is interesting. The article, if I get the numbers right, said that in the last year, the support for environmental and social proposals at AGMs from the investor community has dropped from 35% to 26% or something. And interestingly, a large company like BlackRock, their support has dropped from 43% to 25%. Massive.
Big change.
Now, you can understand, by the way, I'm not saying this in a negative sense. I think it's very easy to be evangelistic and binary about this from time to time. We must all become net zero tomorrow. Right? But when the shoe really starts to pinch, and then you start figuring out the challenges this poses, then the other issues around what's called a just transition, or how do you make sure that people are fairly handled in the process, starts coming to the fore. And so if you look at the investor rationale, they say that some of the proposals were just too extreme. They were too binary. And we had to look and support proposals that made sense, that were appropriate in transition. So I think you're beginning to see that there's an adjustment around, what is a just transition and how do we make sure that we're pragmatic about what really can be done. Nevertheless, in 12 months, the investor support halved. Right? Similarly, the consumer support. I was talking to another customer of ours yesterday, and it was interesting to me that they said they can see in the last 3 months with inflation pressures, a clear shift in buying patterns in the shopping malls. And particularly the supermarkets. People are dialing down to cheaper products. And the minute you start dialing down to cheaper products, you actually less bothered about the green marking on the product. You're more concerned about things are so expensive, how do I get the next bread or whatever it is back home? So I think you will see ups and downs for legitimate reasons over time. And the only way that we can have a sustained long-term agenda around this development is for governments and policy action. One big step, for example, in respect to climate, has to be carbon pricing. right? And so if you want a price on carbon, whether through a carbon tax process or a cap and trade process or whatever you want, this is a government deal. So the governments have got to step in, be able to create and have a long-term plan. So to that extent, what the Singapore government has done in the last year or so is actually quite admirable. We've got a now price for carbon. We've given guidance on a future price for carbon, which goes all the way up to $25 and $40 per ton. And that focuses everybody's attention better than anything else can.
I want to come back to this topic of the just transition that you brought up. But first, we have to have a poll that we've done that we want to pull up onto the screen so everyone can see. We're doing some Twitter polling to get everyone's opinions on these questions too. So a question that we asked is, which stakeholder is most effective at catalyzing corporate climate action in Asia? So hopefully you can pull that up on the screens. You guys can see it around me here. So we asked investors, consumers, or government, and I think far and away here, government was what people thought was actually going to be most effective in making. Is this surprising to you? Or
no,
you
so
totally
this is what
agree?
I said. I think going forward, I think policy action, a role of regulation, a role of governments, carbon pricing, taxes, those are going to be critical in getting us to where we want. Now, it is, of course, you've got to understand, governments do what their voters tell them to do. And the voters are consumers. So at the end of the day, if you decide to turn off gas, because Russia turns off gas, and you have no gas in Germany and people are freezing to death in the winter, the governments will do what is appropriate for the voters, and which will mean we've got to find ways to give people heat and electricity and gas. So these are not completely...
it's all intertwined here,
it is intertwined. And investors do what their funders tell them, right? They must get money from somewhere. So at the end of the day, you've got to get broad society consensus that this is the direction of travel and the path you need to follow. But within that consensus, I really think that there's a lot of room and scope for policy, regulation, pricing frameworks to really get a move on.
I want to bring you back to the just transition piece and how that is particularly relevant here in Asia, where there are cities and areas of extreme wealth and areas of extreme poverty. How do we bring both of those groups along with us in this?
So it is a genuine problem. You know, we at DBS made an announcement, commitment to exit coal 3-4 years ago in phases. I have to tell you, in all my tenure as a leader, this is one of the hardest decisions I made, because I really struggled at length with the moral dimension of the decision. It's very easy to, again, take a binary view, because I was pushed by the investors, pushed by the NGOs, pushed by government saying, you know, coal's bad, get out. But I grew up in a country where electricity was a premium. I grew up all my life where we had 12 hours of blackouts and brownouts. And the only way we could study at night is we had diesel generators. And there's parts of my family even today who live in rural India and the villages, they don't get electricity. So here I'm thinking that electricity is a fundamental right. People need light. Kids, what do you say to a kid in Semarang or somewhere in the middle of Indonesia who's struggling to get electricity to do their studies or eat their food? And for us to say, look, I'm going to sit outside and make a moral judgment on electricity use is less important because the planetary considerations are more important. Am I the right person to say that? Shouldn't the elected government decide that? Shouldn't the democracy of Indonesia decide that? So it's not an easy choice to make. And I struggle with this all the time. How do you make sure that you get the balance right between looking at the developmental social needs of people while doing what we think is important, getting the planetary conditions right? Let me give you another example where we have struggled with it. Palm oil. Now, palm oil is less a climate issue, it's more a biodiversity issue. We move from rainforest to monoculture, and so that is a problem for biodiversity. It's as big a problem as climate in my mind. But on the other hand, there's the reality that there are about 14 million households in Indonesia and Sumatra who rely on small estate palm oil for a living. The Indonesian government 30-40 years ago transmigrated millions of families from Kalimantan to Sumatra and gave them these 1-acre plots to make their living. So the kids, the education, the healthcare, everything relies on this 1-acre plot. And so if you take a binary view saying, hey, stop financing palm oil, get out of this business. So what happens to those 14 million people? Do you leave it to the government? Do you leave it to the fortitude of fate? So these issues of how do you balance, make the trade-offs are tough decisions. And sometimes as a financer, we sit and figure, is it right for us to play God? I don't subscribe to it, but Dr. Mahathir some time ago called this economic colonialism. He said, the people in the north, 10% of the world is now guiding what we need to do after, doing this carbon stuff for 200 years. Now, I think he's got an extreme view, but the underlying spirit that we've got to get this right is correct. At the UN for 20 years, the big debate between the north and south, therefore, was that, okay, we all need to do this, the planet is burning, but how do we make sure that there is an economic leveling between the people who've been actually using carbon? If you go to the US even today, carbon consumption is 22 tons of carbon per annum per person. You go to Indonesia, it's 1.7 tons. So how do you redress that? Right? And therefore, there's a big debate that there should be $100 billion of money, effectively, which needs to flow from the north to the south. Agreement on this was, I think, reached in Kyoto something 20 years ago. So far, zero money flowed. Right? So we have to deal with this. That there are other challenges you've got to deal with side by side with the challenges to the planet. One of the things I've been most excited about, it's a diversion from your direct question, is I think in the last 2-3 years, this pickup of the voluntary carbon markets, I think is an opportunity to redress that balance, to get the economics more leveled across the world. Because with 2,000 companies having made voluntary or net zero commitments in the last 2 years, it's quite clear to me that many of them will not be able to change the business models overnight. These are large, extant infrastructures which need to shift. But through the voluntary carbon markets, many of them are prepared to make financial commitments to really decent carbon projects, which happen to be in countries like Indonesia and in the south. So that might help redress some of the economic challenges you have around this just transition issue. But it's the classic naughty problem.
Do you find it helpful to work with others on this? Like, for example, is GFANS helpful for you? Net Zero Banking Alliance. Like, is this something where you're looking to your peers and you're like, okay, if you're going to take this cold jump, I'll take the cold jump too? Or how helpful is that for you?
It's actually helpful, obviously. There's power in many people, and you get some of the effect you're talking about. But I tell you, there's help from two or three other reasons as well. Number one, the issues are complex. And therefore, the more people who are applying their minds to it, and the more you can talk to, the better and more nuanced your own thinking becomes on what is good and what's not good. Everybody's struggling with the same issues. And therefore, whether it's the GFANS or the Net Zero Alliance, it gets a lot of people together to understand and talk to the issues. That's helpful. The second big thing is I think you need a level playing field around the world. You need consistency in standards, in rules, in measurement processes, in disclosure standards. Global agencies, both public sector, private sector, GFANS, they help in making sure that there is a consistency in how do you approach it, what do you measure, how do you get forward. So that's extremely helpful as well. And then finally, it's your third point said, it's a galvanizing platform, right? And so it just energizes everybody to get on the right boat.
So imagine we have about 2 minutes left. Imagine we're back here next year having this conversation again. What do you think is going to change about sustainability, ESG in the next year?
Laura, I think we are in the midst of a really interesting time. On the one hand, there's some headwinds to the progress that have been made in the last 5 years. And the headwinds come from the Ukraine-Russia war and the focus on energy security suddenly. Right? And so I started off saying that all over Europe, the fact that you're held hostage to gas, you might not get gas, electricity is a premium, means in the last 6 months, people are reopening coal mines, people are relying more and more on gas. The Australians have stopped exporting coal to China because guess what? They can now export it to Germany instead, and they get a better price. So you're seeing some headwinds from that standpoint. And therefore, that's going to be somewhat challenging in terms of the pace of progress. But I also see the glass half full. I think you're also seeing progress in a positive sense. One, I'm quite encouraged that notwithstanding the short-term energy challenges, most countries and regions have reiterated the commitment to stepping up the renewable or low-carbon energy agenda. Right? And so I think the direction of travel will become faster, not slower. Second, I think a lot of governments have started actually raising money for the purpose. The EU head of budget was around in the region recently. They want to do this $800 billion fund, of which $250 billion will be on green. The Singapore government announced $35 billion of a green bond for green social development. So I think people are really committing to long-term fundraising and long-term investments in making that transition happen. So I do think you continue to see sustained momentum. One of the other things I'm encouraged by is the S, not just G. I think there's been a rethink in the last 2 years on the back of COVID in terms of fiscal policies and fiscal agendas. The amount of money the governments have been able to spend or willing to spend on looking after the social needs at the bottom of the pyramid also gives you some confidence that people are rethinking the agenda. The IMF 2 years ago would have told you a deficit of 3% and debt of so much is complete no. Today they're all changing and saying if it makes sense for the economy and the people, maybe you should consider it. So I do think the long-term trends are being aided. There will be some short-term ups and downs and headwinds. But on the whole, I think we're headed in the right direction.
Fantastic. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
All
Join
right.
me in thanking
Thank you very
Piyush Gupta,
much.
CEO of DBS Bank.
Please welcome to the stage Edris Boey, Head of ESG Research at Maitri Asset Management, Colin Chen, Managing Director and Head of ESG Finance for Asia Pacific in the Asian Investment Banking Division of MUFG Bank, and Vincent Mortier, Group Chief Investment Officer at Amundi, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Cheryl Lee.
Hi everyone. We are really seeing the effects of climate change today, whether it's floods, droughts, or food shortages. And governments around the world and financial institutions are increasingly recognizing that in order to solve these problems, we have to be able to define and measure them. So one of the tools we have for doing that today are these taxonomies, which help us establish which economic activities and products are beneficial to our planet and which ones are harmful. So on that note, I'm really excited today to be able to kick off our panel discussions with this session on navigating new ESG taxonomies. And with that, let's jump right in. So one of the most hotly debated areas of ESG taxonomies today is the fact that the EU has included natural gas into its green taxonomy. So publicly, some asset managers have already come out to say that, even though it has been included, they won't count it as green. I would like to ask Vincent, what's Amundi's policy on natural gas, and what's your view on this issue?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Worth mentioning that, in fact, the EU taxonomy has included indeed gas, but also nuclear power. And at Amundi, we really believe nuclear power is compulsory in the energy mix to achieve net zero. And we are very pushing for EU to include as well nuclear power, even though some, of course, European countries were reluctant to do so. So, now we've got a EU taxonomy which is wide enough, I would say, to achieve a credible net zero ambition. But for us, taxonomy, and EU has been working a lot on it since quite some years, is a necessary step. So it's a good guide to invest, but it cannot be the only metric to manage portfolios. So it's for us and for our clients, it's just a point in time, an indication, but you need to keep in mind that under the EU taxonomy, only 5% of the MSCI World Index is taxonomy compatible. So with 5%, you cannot build a portfolio. So it's an indicator, but it can be only complemented with other approaches, because otherwise you build portfolios which are really unbalanced. So something we are really educating our clients with, because in the EU questionnaire distributors are giving to clients. If a client is saying I want a high degree of taxonomy, let's say 20%, it's very difficult to accommodate, while 20% might not be very impressive for a client. So that's why for us it's a useful information, but we cannot manage only through a taxonomy.
Right. Thanks, Vincent. Yeah. And I know that, on this panel, we also have people from Asia, Edris and Colin. So for Singapore, we have come up with a traffic light sort of taxonomy system. And then you have red, yellow, and green activities depending on how aligned they are to these environmental objectives. So natural gas, like we were talking about earlier, is under yellow transition. Edris, how do you see this traffic light system affecting Maitri's investment decisions? Because it seems that it has added a layer of complexity on top of the binary green or non-green in terms of how much money should I channel to green, how much to yellow, and whether there should be a shift away from yellow as time goes by.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your question. I would see this question as if we were to just look at the investments that we want to make in Asia, rather than putting them in buckets so easily or so quickly on the first phase. Because if we take a step back, ASEAN is a region that stands to lose 35% of GDP by 2050 if we don't work on climate change. China is also a country that stands to lose 45% of their GDP by 2100 if they don't act on climate change. So if we were to look at any decarbonization strategy that's happening within ASEAN, actually, or in Asia, for the matter of fact, there's no feasible decarbonization strategy that does not include natural gas. With this problem, with this understanding and this knowledge, we really had to then apply and understand that natural gas has to be part of the solution. And if we were to look at how the EU taxonomy was the journey of the EU taxonomy development, they also did consider the traffic light system. And that's what ASEAN, the ASEAN taxonomy is, which is currently, my understanding is it's under public consultation. That's what it has actually proposed, the traffic light system, because it is a part of a reality here.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see that affecting Maitri's investment? How are you factoring it in? How are you preparing for it when it's finally, finalized?
Well, so because we look at the problem statement as it is part of the solution, what we do have for our sustainable fund is a coal exclusion, a thermal coal exclusion. But when we don't have necessarily a natural gas exclusion for now, but when we engage companies in Asia, that is where we talk to them about what is their transition plan like. And Maitri is a part of AIGCC. We have an Asia Electric Utility Program. When we speak to the companies, they are also quite appreciative that we understand in the context of Asia needs natural gas, but what we are trying to get them to do is, okay, if they have a strategy to phase out or phase down natural gas or fossil fuels by, say, 2040, we will engage them and ask them, is it possible to do something by 2030? So that's what we do.
Right. So seeing how different regions have different standards and definitions, if I were a company and I was operating in a sector in which region A classified my activities as green and region B did not, I think that I would get my financing done in region A. So I would like to ask Colin, do you think that is an oversimplification? And what are you seeing in terms of opportunities for your bank when it comes to regulatory arbitrage?
Yeah, that's a good word to use, regulatory arbitrage. That opens up a whole can of worms when we look across the world. Taxonomies are just a method of classification, right? So I think that when the EU started their taxonomies, it put things in particular buckets, and they looked at it and said, coal is a bucket that we don't like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think some of them we can easily agree on. And as you heard from the previous conversation, the governments who run these these processes are very much driven by their own requirements. And if the gas is turned off in Germany, someone will say that maybe that's a little less intensive than it should be, and even more so in Asia. And as you heard, the level of development has a direct impact on the kind of emphasis that you have on these different parts of the thing. So what I would agree that there is that possibility, but these are not financial instruments. You can't take a swap from New York and arbitrage it with something else in Asia, right? I mean, if you're looking at building a gas-fired power plant, as you might in a particular region, you can't export that and arbitrage it with something else in another country. That is very much tied to that particular country. So while there is that fear that you could do it, I think that as long as people understand that the overall plan is there, that you reduce your carbon emissions with what you have planned, it will be done, and there will not be immense carbon regulatory arbitrage, as you said.
Mm-hmm. So Vincent, that's from a financier's point of view. What does the asset management industry think about regulatory arbitrage?
Well, that's a very important topic, because indeed we can, ESG and in particular in climate, we can see quite some big divide between countries, and in particular the approaches and the tensions we are seeing in the US, where, to be fair, there are lots of different point of views and pressures to be put on asset managers regarding what they are doing, and it's, I was in the US not long ago, and I have been accused of being woke, because we were very active in ESG and we were against capitalism, so that's quite harsh. Yeah. I was not expecting such a harsh action, to be fair. At the same time, when I go to Germany, they are very against nuclear power, and they are very also quite direct and harsh. So we need to be aware of this, and at Amundi we have decided to have a framework which is valid across the globe, and not to arbitrate indeed. And some clients, can opt out if they want, but at least we have a backbone of ESG integration in all our funds, what we call mainstreaming, so excluding coal, for example, but not only. And to have a best-in-class approach, which is, I think, the only way forward. Taxonomy, one of the issues in taxonomy everywhere, whatever the taxonomy is that it's an exclusion-based. And in our portfolios, you prefer to have some traditional oil producers, but to engage with them and to have in our portfolios only the best-in-class, or the ones which are really moving the right direction. And it's the only way to reconcile the trajectory and the dynamic approach, and also to still have performances in our portfolios, because the least we want is for our clients to say, I need to choose between being ESG and perform. Because if you are not able to reassure clients that being ESG is not against performance, then otherwise it will only be a niche product, and we don't want it to be a niche, we want it to be mainstream. And when you exclude, don't worry, you will always find a buyer somewhere in private sphere of the assets, and so it won't solve anything. So it's better to engage with companies, and we did a lot of work to engage with the big corporates for that trajectory. And that one also, an issue we are seeing more and more, and we are trying to educate the regulators on it. And taxonomy, at least in Europe, is quite static. While what's important for us is a trajectory. And for example, today, if you want to build a net zero portfolio and to overweight companies which are in a good trajectory, starting from a high demanding point, it's not compatible with a high degree of taxonomy. Mm-hmm. It's by nature and contradiction. So if you want to build this kind of portfolio, the universe is very, very narrow. Yeah. So at one moment in time, you need to choose some angles. So that's why for us, taxonomy is just a useful tool. Mm-hmm. But really, regulators should not think it is the alpha and omega of ESG.
Right.
At the end of the day.
Right.
You know, if a traffic light had only red light and green light,
Yeah.
then, you know, it's a binary question, right? It's either in that bucket or the other bucket. But the fact that we have a amber light or
Yes.
orange light means that there is a view that how things are going to go. It's transition on that point, and that, in my view, determines the trajectory of how you're going. Because the red light portion is, you know, where you want to end up, i.e. not doing that particular stuff. So I think it's very useful to have, in this particular case, gas in the green, in the amber bucket, as it were.
Yeah,
Right.
because for it to actually be in the amber market, you must have a timeline on when you're actually going to be shifting from yellow to green.
Yeah.
So that's the trajectory.
Yeah, so let's broaden the scope a little to look at the idea behind the taxonomy. I mean, another ESG framework that we have seen in the EU, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR, I mean, it was introduced as a disclosure framework. Nowadays, the way it's used is we have asset managers using it as a labeling device to sell Article 8, Article 9 funds. What do you think, Edris, about taxonomies? Will they have a similar result, and what would be the implications of that?
Question is for me? Oh, no.
I
Not
think,
edges. You can answer it too, Vincent.
I think I want to take a step back and answer this question by perhaps looking at the greenwashing problem statement. If an investor today says, I would like to invest in an EV company because I think it will help with the decarbonizing the world. And then I decide, okay, I would also like to add a solar or a wind company into my portfolio. And after a while, the investor thinks, you know, I think it's probably easier if I just go and invest in an index. So so the investor goes and invests in an index. And the index is a climate index or climate fund. And if a company in this climate index, so they're all directed towards decarbonization. If a company in that index is one day found to have ESG controversies such as sexual harassment allegations, racism allegations, retrenchment, lawsuits against them, technically speaking, those are social, they fall under the S bucket of issues. But what we're seeing a lot in the market is investors who invested in the climate fund are saying, hey, how did this company actually pass the ESG benchmark? There is then a blurring of line between the initial intention of the investor who wanted to invest in a climate fund, which the investor did, and then subsequent consequences that happen, which are not related to the climate strategy of the companies. Where I see taxonomies coming in is they're trying to regulate the other side of things, where what can a fund manager come up with in terms of the product? What constitutes a climate fund? What constitutes an ESG fund? What is the, say, bare minimum criteria for a fund to be labeled ESG? Inherently, there's actually two sides of this problem statement. One is the investor education, which is the intention as well as the impact that the investor wanted to create at the start, versus where the fund manager's intention was when the fund was created. The taxonomy addresses the second part, and I think with the different taxonomies that come up, the investors need to educate themselves and understand different jurisdictions have different levels of frameworks, because every country and region is at a different stage of whether it is climate journey or ESG journey. So they come up with something that's relevant for themselves. And an investor could be a global investor. So the investor would then have to self-educate. And it's a simultaneous process. So I don't see that they are distinct. It can be very confusing for the investor. I acknowledge that. But I think at this point in time, especially if we talk about the climate issue in E which is part of ESG, the climate emergency is upon us. And we do need to take effort to try and understand what the problem actually is and how to create impact to solve the problem.
Vincent, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, based on the European experience, so we've got SFDR, MiFID II, and you know, the French regulator 2 weeks ago said, the head of AMF said, we are within a regulatory nightmare for the next 2 years. And I have to say that at Amundi, we are living a constant headache because regulation is super complex to be and evolving a lot, contradictory sometimes, requiring a lot of teaching, investment, and so Article 8, Article 9, now Article 9 becoming much more difficult to obtain, and therefore all funds will be Article 8, basically, more or less. And so it's I mean, regulators are also understanding more and more and learning day after day all the shortfalls. And I really I think given the fact that we worked on it a little bit in advance in Europe, it should be very helpful for other countries to not do the same mistakes in a way, because we did some mistakes. For sure, and to be fair, it's still in the making. So, and our clients, meaning our distributors in particular, are totally lost in the classification, in the way what they can disclose or not, the way to label. So what you are seeing in Europe more and more is distributors moving away from taxonomy, classification, etc., but adopting national labels. So we've got in each European country some labels, which are very different from each other. So between Belgium, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, France, I can tell you, commonalities are limited. So now to manage a pan-European fund sold anywhere in Europe, it's becoming very difficult if you want to have a label in each country, because it is not reconcilable. So that's a growing concern as well, is to have fragmentation, which each country pushing its own label under the pressure of local interests. And then it is totally against the European common market. And unfortunately, given the degree of complexity of the regulation at European levels, local regulators are more and more distancing themselves. And it's something very specific in Europe, is that there is a huge degree of interpretation at local level that is enabled by the European Commission. So you might thought we have a pan-European strong regulation. It's true looking from far away, but it's not really true in reality. Each country is very autonomous. So I am very concerned by this growing divide. And so more and more we are creating clones of funds with some variations of process to be adapted to the Febelfin label in Belgium, for example, or the Lux flag label in Luxembourg. So it's also another nightmare, to be fair, because instead of one single product, we will end up into having 12, 20 products.
Right. So Vincent talked about the growing divide between some countries. What do you think, Colin, about Asia? How are we solving that problem and putting aside differences?
Yeah. I think Vincent brings up a very good point. I mean, a lot of the issues and our clients are local. Right? Everybody's local. It's just that they're local in the country that they're local, right? And they have different views and different ways of looking at things. What we've come across is that there is a growing realization that the endpoint is the same. They all want to reach net zero. You know, when they reach it, how they reach it, that's all different. But the endpoint is the same. And how to get there, that's the key question that we all need to look at. And the other point I was going to mention is that when we started this journey, everybody looked at ESG as a word, but it's not. It's three letters, right? It's environmental, social, and governance, and everything has a part to play. As Edris mentioned, initially people looked at it. I want to join a climate fund, thinking it's ESG, but it's not, right? It's just the climate portion of it. There are other bits of it that are equally important, or even more important these days, as you look at these things that come up. So what I feel is that there is a convergence of people's understanding of what they need to put into it. It's taking a bit longer than we would hope. And that's partly because Asia is very varied. If I look at the target for China, it's 2060 to reach net zero. I mean, that's one of the overall targets we want to meet. If I look for India, it's 2070, but they have different ways of meeting that, and so on and so forth. So as a bank and as any financier or any financial institution, we need to take that into account when we set our own targets on how to make these things go forward. And taxonomies are useful in that they provide a standardized definition of what you want to look at. Targets are different in different countries, and that's where you make your adjustments, and that's where your flexibility needs to be there as a financial institution. So that's sort of the way I think that Asia is moving. The other point, of course, is that we're at a different developmental stage, and even within Asia, Australia is different from Laos, and so on and so forth. So that needs also to be taken into consideration.
Yep, absolutely. With that, we just have a couple of minutes left. Happy to take any questions from the floor. Well, if not, I have one more. So for Edris, the E part of ESG taxonomies has been in the spotlight lately. Earlier on, you were talking about the S. So with that, do you think that, to what extent do we need a social taxonomy, or do you think that issues such as supply chain, gender equality, the right to unionize, they already are issues that companies and the financial industry has incentives and mechanisms to take into account?
Let's put it this way. I think there are a lot of problem statements that we're trying to solve. ESG is a form of classification. It's principles of classification of issues that we can dissect and then try and solve it. Why is it that C is, the climate issue is out of the E, is driving the whole ESG? The way I see it is it's quantifiable. It is, when it's quantifiable, it is easier to understand because the direction of where we want to go, as Colin was mentioning, we know that lower is better, right, in terms of emissions. So when it's easier to communicate that, it's easier to get people on board and understand, it's easier to set targets. And when we achieve it, we actually know we've achieved it. Having said that, addressing the climate issue is not just a climate or an E issue. There are a lot of interlinks between the E and the S. I think Piyush Gupta earlier mentioned a lot about just transition, and it's something that is very close to our hearts as well. When we look at trying to solve the climate issue, we are trying to solve the climate issue for people. When we are trying to solve the issue for people, then we have to try and figure out what is going to be sustainable in the long term, rather than just trying to solve the C, the climate issue, for the people, but then not include the people as part of the solution. I don't think that's going to work. So I don't think there's going to be a way that we can separate the E from the S. I think the just transition principles, that is actually part of the net zero company benchmark. That's part of the Climate Action 100 Plus. A lot of acronyms and a lot of frameworks that we talk about. The just transition is actually one of the indicators, 10 indicators. It's the 9th one. It is still in the beta mode. But the thing is, we do need to consider, the people who are working in those industries that will be affected by the decarbonization transition. Where are they going to be working at? When we look at the cost of energy in this decarbonization process, how easy or how difficult, how much is it going to affect the businesses at the end of the day? I think those issues will then affect whether or not we're able to lift more people out of poverty within ASEAN and Asia, or are we going to be keeping them or putting more people in below the poverty line? So I think it's very important to consider the E and the S issues together.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Edris. And with that, we're at the end of our panel. Thank you.
Everybody, I'm David Ingles, and today we have a very special guest. I'm thrilled, I'm excited to be joined right now by the CEO of Yum China, Joey Wat. Joey, as always, of course, thank you so much for taking part, for making time for us today. There's lots to get through here at our Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. I guess let's start off. When we have these types of conversations about sustainability, we all know it's an abstract concept. So I think I wanted to get straight to it. And as it pertains to your specific business, things like running a restaurant, making sure your supply chain is in line, can you just talk us through the main operational areas where this sort of very abstract concept becomes very tangible in how you do your business?
Thank you. For us, the whole concept of sustainability, although it's still a bit abstract at this point, but we already see the sustainability as a very integral part of our business growth strategy. Correct. It's part of the growth. We grow with it.
The last 12 months, we've had a war, an ongoing war. Obviously, what's happening on the ground in Shanghai and across parts of China has presented its share of challenges. What challenges have you faced as far as your supply chain, and how do you think that's going to be more sustainable moving forward as far as lessons learned?
The biggest challenge for us at that time, for many companies, is the supply chain, because obviously it was very difficult. Fortunately, our 35 years hard work in in-house logistic and supply chain system works wonder, and magical things happen because our logistics center, our truck, all these are tailor-made for Yum China, and they were amazing. And we have intelligent and digitized supply chain visibility within the company, so we know where are the stock, and then we can move them around between the store and between the brand. And also, not only we have some store that's still operating, we also are one of the very few companies that have our own in-house delivery riders. So our delivery riders can deliver food to some customers and some employees. And when some of these delivery riders cannot serve, our headquarters staff, with the culture of helping each other, our headquarters staff actually step in, use their own car, and drive around to deliver food. The most senior person became part of the delivery team was the general manager of Pizza Hut. He was one of the delivery riders. It was challenging, but for our company, it became such a morale building process. And personally, and for the management team, we are so grateful that we have such amazing group of staff that we try our very, very best. And we talk about it in the last quarter earning release, and for 10% of the stores were opening during that time, they achieved 40-50% of the sales for the entire market in China, because the demand is so big. But our team worked very hard to serve our community. So yes, it was very tough, but we have a very positive team. We take every challenge as an opportunity to become better and serve our customer better.
Let me talk about scope 3, because for you to be able to then measure your entire carbon footprint, indirectly, everything else, let's put it that way. How many suppliers do you have? Just a rough ballpark figure before I ask the next question.
Few hundred suppliers, yes.
Okay, and how do you then make sure that you're talking to them? What conversations are you having so they then can abide by your own sort of sustainability objectives?
Very good question again. I resonate your question that the scope 3 is the most challenging one for everyone, and including for Yum China, because 2/3 of our greenhouse emission come from the purchased good, and that means from our suppliers. And when we embark on the journey of defining the roadmap and the inventory of how to achieve that greenhouse emission reduction, we immediately start the conversation with our suppliers, and we seek their constructive opinions, because we have to do it together. We cannot do it alone. We know it from day one. So we have the conversation and we get their opinion, and then we put together a roadmap. So that's point one. And the challenge is very profound. The challenges are very profound. We know that. But once we start the conversation, we realize every single of our suppliers, they want to be part of it. They want to do it. And we are very grateful that we have a platform now within our own system that we can continue that dialogue, and we'll continue to adjust the plan because the direction is there, the goal is there, but how to get there, we have to learn at the same time. It's just reality. So that's point one. Point two is we set the greenhouse emission as one of the KPI for suppliers to work with us. So we want to achieve the target. We want our supplier to be committed to it, and it's one of the requirements. It's not a big secret that might work. And then number three is we're going to offer training sessions for ourselves and for our suppliers so that we can learn with each other and learn together. And then last but not least, we launched a pilot program. We already did it with poultry and packaging suppliers to develop a carbon footprint scorecard. Because while we are still exploring, it's always good to have this pilot, and we have the very proper learning process. And then once the pilot program works, then obviously we're going to expand this. So step by step, I think our supplier and ourselves, we have reasonable confidence that we can have a pretty good chance with the commitment that we already have, which is greenhouse emission, zero carbon greenhouse emission by 2050. Thank you.
Right, and it looks like that could be a good starting point. Just an update, I guess, on that when we have this conversation, hopefully again 12 months from now. As a final question, more to do really with what's happening with the world more than your company because of the war. I need to ask you because you're in the business. As far as the food supply issue of the world, that goes into a sustainability aspect too. Do you think the world has a food supply issue?
Well, I hope not. I mean, although right now the uncertainties in this world are just beyond imagination of many clever people. But we try our very best, at least in China market, to do what is right and what we can do. Therefore, in terms of sustainability, it's also part of our big focus to utilize our intelligent and digitized supply chain platform within our system that we can minimize food wastage. I do believe that there's a lot of wastage within the supply chain distribution system around the world that we can still improve so that we can feed more people. And we are going to do our part. But the technology of intelligent digitized supply chain must be in place, and therefore it has been our focus for many years, and we are very happy that we can share to the rest of our investor community that we are there. We have the system in place right now.
Yeah,
within Yum China system. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you so much, and hopefully, by the way, not just feed people, feed people healthy food too. Joey, thank you so much. We'll speak again, of course, and hopefully get an update there. Joey Wat, CEO of Yum China.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Esther N, Chief Sustainability Officer at City Developments Limited, Maurizio Brusadelli, Executive Vice President and President of Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa at Mondelēz International, and Jacqueline Lamb, Southeast Asia Regional Lead for Global Sustainability Policy and Partnerships at Boeing International, for a conversation with Bloomberg's David Scanlon.
Thank you, Voice of God, for that introduction. And so great to be here. Good morning, everybody. Isn't it great to be back at a live event, especially when it's so packed? Feels like a Billie Eilish concert here. I feel like I won the lottery when I was asked to do this panel, not only because of the high caliber of our guests, but for this topic. Whenever we do these discussions around Scope 3 at these events, there's always so much interest. And I think it's because Scope 3 is so difficult, right? We know Scope 1, Scope 2 is really about what you're doing, right? Your direct emissions or indirect. Scope 3 is what your suppliers are doing. Much, much more challenging. It's kind of like at the dinner table, right? I can decide to eat my vegetables, but can I get the kids to eat the vegetables, right? So it's kind of the same idea. So let's dive right into it. We'll start with Jacqueline at Boeing. I can only imagine how many suppliers and how many parts go into a 737. But how are you managing this whole challenge around Scope 3?
Right. Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. And it's really a mammoth task, as you mentioned. So with Scope 3, we're working both ends of the upstream and downstream ends of the supply chain. Where upstream, we've got our suppliers' code of conduct, working with the diverse range of suppliers on really building the awareness for sustainability, ensuring the accountability, the reporting, and as well as the governance around it. So we're working with partners like CDP, the International Aerospace Environmental Group as well, to make sure that the entire ecosystem is very much a whole of industry approach, really. And so we want to continue to take those efforts forward and work with all of the supply chain to ensure that the sustainability is built into all of our products as well.
Yeah, let's bring Maurizio in here. You're a whole different industry, from chocolates to Oreo cookies to clarets you've got today.
Yes.
How are you managing it at Mondelēz?
I mean, you said rightly, and I have 2 kids, but on Scope 3, we have many kids. As a company, we started to obviously measure Scope 1 and Scope 2 since many, many years. And I think this helped us to be ready to measure Scope 3. We have the ambition to reduce to zero our carbon emission by 2050. And 94% of our emission are on Scope 3. So we really need to work end-to-end from the field to the shelf, together with our suppliers, as you said as well, Jacqueline, and making sure that we address this in the right way. We started, obviously, to measure Scope 3 as well and to create targets. 2050 seems to be very far away, but it's behind the corner. And I would say the most challenging part for us is to manage raw materials. 70% of our Scope 3 are in 4 raw materials. That's why we started our own sustainable ingredient sourcing program, like Cocoa Life or Harmony Wheat or sustainable palm oil, that is really helping us to work with our suppliers to reduce Scope 3. And then there is logistics, but I'm more than happy to go deeper later. So we give a little
Fantastic,
bit of room
yeah.
for you as well.
94%, that's just
Yes.
astounding, right? It just gives you the sense of the magnitude of the challenge. Esther, real estate, a little bit different, but similar challenges. How is CDL coping in this?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, definitely, this is probably the most challenging subject, and I would say that we actually learn by doing. Okay, we've been committed to green building since early 2000s, and we seriously really deep dive into the subject of Scope 3 when we actually plans to apply to SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, in 2016. So that is when, the Scope 3 came into our life, which is like a challenging part of our life. So we are not just looking at Scope 1 and 2, but we have to really study and understand the 15 categories of the Scope 3. And of course, as a building, developer, building owners, and a sizable group, you have to. Actually, the biggest items is not just the building materials. It's actually our subsidiaries' operations, including our buildings, commercial buildings, and also the hotel operations and all, because their Scope 1 and 2 is the parent company's Scope 3. And it's like a huge thing. It's like a family tree of a big clan. This is the parent, and then you don't know which DNA you are connected to, and then you end up, you're like, oh, this is also my responsibility. Subsidiary and supplier and contractor, almost everything they do, even tenants, is also my Scope 3. Hello, this is growing bigger and bigger. So, we are still learning by doing it, and it doesn't help that some of the standards are still expanding. If you look at greenhouse gas protocol, they have the corporate standard, they have the value chain, supply chain standards, they have product standard. So it's our life as sustainability professional is getting tougher and tougher. And of course, plus all the reporting frameworks and standards. Not that many, 600 over only. It's quite a scary life, for sustainability. But of course, joke aside, it's not the more the merrier. We have to choose those that really, capture the impact of our business. That is materials to our business, to our investors and stakeholders. Yeah.
Yeah. And let's talk about, Jacqueline, some of the pitfalls in measuring all this, because it really comes down to data, doesn't it? My boss, Mike Bloomberg, would say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So how are you coping with this array of data you need to in order to measure what you've got, right?
Absolutely. So I think on the supply chain side, that is absolutely, such a challenging task, as Esther mentioned, the range of reporting requirements and the metrics that are being used. But I think another really key way for us to look at our Scope 3, and our Scope 3 is very much, the bulk of it is use of products, use of sold products. And the largest part of it is how do we work with our airline partners as well. That's their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and how are we working with them to ensure that through fleet renewal, for example, that they're reducing up to 25% of their carbon footprint, and through operational efficiency, that they'll be reducing up to 15% of their carbon emissions as well. But really, the largest lever that we are trying to collectively work on as an industry is the energy transition in the use of aircraft from Jet A kerosene to sustainable aviation fuel, which will allow up to 80% of carbon emissions reduction. And so these are the types of metrics that we'd be looking at, as an industry to really actively bring down the Scope 3 from the Boeing perspective, but working very closely downstream with the airlines on the use of the sold product on their end as well.
Right. Just to follow on that, it kind of comes back to the vegetable analogy, if I may. How do you, force an airline to get rid of an old jet? I mean, it's perfectly fine. It's 20 years old, but
well,
it's not as efficient, clearly.
Right now, with the the kerosene prices, the jet fuel prices, there's a huge incentive because the energy efficiency, sure, the engine efficiency that it brings with the new fleet, there's immediate cost savings for the airlines as well that's involved, And as we continue, as Boeing continues to work towards, our target for 100% SAF compatibility across all our aircraft models, that also helps the airlines make that decision to buy the newer aircraft models that can, at a later stage, be compatible with as much SAF as they want to put into their engine. That will help them, have the largest impact in reducing their carbon emissions reduction at fuel combustion point, which is for them their largest scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as well.
And Maurizio, how are you? Just what are the pitfalls as you look at the data landscape as you're trying to measure this? What are some of your challenges?
Yeah, as I said before, for us it's mainly agriculture. So the sourcing of the ingredients in the right way is very, very important. Obviously, as you said, we are part of the SBTi, and we join as well all the other races that are happening there to make sure that we help each other. As a big company, we can have our own sustainable ingredient programs. Cocoa Life is a very important program, and we plan to have by 2025 100% of the cocoa that we need for our chocolate brands sourced through Cocoa Life, and this is obviously helping the emission, but as well helping the life of the people that are growing cocoa. Same on wheat. By the end of this year, Europe will be 100% on the Harmony Wheat program. It is a program that is preserving biodiversity in the way our partners are growing wheat, sustaining, obviously, or reducing the use of water, reducing the emission. And I think this is a very important part as well. Sustainability is also part of one of our 4 pillars of the long-term growth strategy. So everyone in the organization, at senior leader, we are incentivized, obviously, to make sure that not only we set targets, but we reach those targets. And there is a strong governance as well at management level, at board level, a governance that we started like you more than, I would say, almost a decade ago, since the beginning of this company, Mondelēz International, 10 years ago. And lastly, we have to work as well on logistics, because 70% is ingredient, but we have around 10% on logistics as well. And logistics means optimization of routes, the way we fill in containers and truck, the ability to use truck that are with different fuel and not the fuel of today. So it's complex. I try to simplify. It is comprehensive, but I think Scope 1 and Scope 2 measuring process and targets helped and are helping us to make sure that we are efficient and effective in reducing Scope 3 as well, which, as I said, is almost all outside our company.
Right. So challenging. Esther, how are you managing the data minefield?
That is actually when we first started 15 years ago, we started our sustainability reporting. And at that time, really very single-minded. Okay, GRI 36 indicator. Okay, can be done, tick boxing and all that. But over time, you have to learn. It's like, hey, it's not just about ticking boxes and all that. And I think the turning point is actually 2010 when we actually report to CDP. Okay, that is when we started to really deep dive into collecting carbon data, energy data, and also try to make sense of it, to learn about it. And I think SBTi, it's actually one of the most difficult tasks that I have achieved in my whole journey of 27 years in sustainability. It took us almost 9 months to, get the first set of our carbon reduction target validated by the scientists. 8 to 9 months almost can make a baby. It was difficult because the scientists really look at numbers, past data, current number, and also the projection, whether it makes sense, whether it's ambitious enough. The whole idea of SBTi is to push you to, set ambitious targets so that you will find solutions to do it. Human, issue that if someone is whipping you behind, you will work harder on innovations and technology, which actually it really helps when you track data, because we have a whole ecosystem. And mind you, building and construction activities globally account for 40%, more than 40% now, greenhouse gas emission. And not just how you design and build, but operation of existing building is the biggest challenge. Yeah, so especially the older building. So Race to Zero now has already garnered support of like almost supporters, organizations, cities and regions that account for about 91% of the global GDP. So it is going to be a big movement. You like it or not, you have to get on the bus. So how do you measure? What do you measure? What are the scope? And how specific you should be, because you can't just say that, oh, I pledge for net zero. And I will tell you whether I can achieve it by 2050, right? You won't get away because annually you have to submit, data to SBTi. And when we pledged to SBTi in 2018, it was 2-degree warmer scenario alignment. And last year, after 3 years, because we pledged to 1.5 degree, and we actually raised the bar to align with 1.5. So all the data has to be more aggressive already. And last February, we also pledged to net zero using the World Green Building Council framework. And when a company pledges to net zero, you have to be specific. Otherwise, you will be deemed as like greenwashing. And just like Mauricio said, our Scope 3 account for more than 90%. So that is because we have quite a sizable, international operation, hotels, 130 over hotels. So we have to account for all the operation. That's why it accounts for so much, 90% of our overall carbon.
And of course, you're referring to the SBTi, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's such an alphabet soup in all this ESG stuff. So it's good to explain what we're talking about. So this whole push around climate change is about changing behavior, isn't it, for all of us, whether it's individuals or companies or governments. It'd be great if you could each give us an example of what behavior you have changed at your company as a result of the challenges around Scope 3. What have you done differently?
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think really because of the need to partner with airlines in reducing the Scope 3 emissions on use of sold products, we've been working, very, very closely with them, especially on the, not just with the airlines, but also with the energy sector on the energy transition for aviation from fossil to sustainable aviation fuel. So on the airlines front, we've been working on aggregating demand through book and claim SAF credits, for example, and Boeing has made our own SAF purchase, 2 million gallons last year with Epic Fuels for our own operations. So we see that there is very much a need for multi-industry effort. So we're working on scaling demand, but we're also working on scaling supply of sustainable aviation fuel through some of our investments, for example, partnerships with Sky Energy, with Alders Fuel, and around the region, there's been a lot of advocacy around looking at, Asia Pacific by 2050 can actually be the global leading producer of sustainable aviation fuel. The projection is at about 170 million tons by 2050, compared to Europe and the US at about 90 million tons, 76 million tons each. So how do we get Asia Pacific to be that global producer of sustainable aviation fuel, and how do we work with governments in terms of advocacy, enabling policy frameworks to be in place? And that's one of the big areas that we've been, you probably noticed if you're following Boeing's social media posts, etc. In the last 12, 18 months, there's been a big push towards an industry-wide sort of embracing of sustainable aviation fuel to really tackle that Scope 3 work and bringing down the emissions for industry as a whole.
Wow, that sounds very ambitious, but heartening at the same time. Maurizio?
Yeah,
what are you doing differently?
Yes, for us, it's many years that we report officially. We have a sustainability report, so everything is very transparent, and I think this is very important, both internally and externally. As I said before, we have our own sourcing program, but as a company, we are as well partnering with other companies. A supplier of an ingredient is obviously a supplier of another company, maybe a competitor as well. So given the size of our company, we were and we are very open to continue to work and partner with companies and also with governments to make sure that we join the effort to really reduce Scope 3 emission. As I said before, part of the strategy. So I am managing the strategy for the region, and sustainability is something that we discuss very, very often. It is a cost, as we know. So it's something that is not coming for free. And I think embracing this and really working hard to find a solution that could offset the cost and reach maybe even higher reduction on scope 3 is something that is challenging and really giving our people the opportunity to lean in and participate. Especially for the young generation, is very important. A company with the right value, right ambition, and the right vision on sustainability. And in many interviews, I have people asking me, or newcomers, what are we really doing? That's why we continue to communicate internally and externally.
Right.
And then there is deforestation, which obviously is very, very important, and we want to reduce it, and this is what we are doing with the sourcing program that I explained before. So it is, I would say, something that has been accelerated in the last 2-3 years. Scope 1 and Scope 2 was always there, but for us, I wouldn't say it's simpler, but it's simpler. Scope 3 is more challenging, so we need the help of everyone.
Yeah. Esther, what have you done differently at CDL?
Well, I think changing mindset is difficult, but imparting skill set is as challenging. And today we have this, climate emergency. You can't just slowly teach a person to change their behavior. We have gone past that stage already. So we look at the most important thing is we all make sure the whole value chain, the whole ecosystem of internal and external stakeholders are going to the right direction. So the first pillars that we look at is integration. ESG in the good old days are always, described as non-financial. So this has been thrown out of the window already. Anything to do with ESG, it has a financial impact. So integration is very important, and sustainability is not a good to have. It has to be truly integrated into the whole business strategy, and not just today, but the growth strategy as well. And I'm really, really very fortunate that I only report to the Board Sustainability Committee, playing a strategic role, not an operational role. So integration is very important. And how do you engage a larger ecosystem of we have the architect, engineer, suppliers, contractor. How do you change behavior? How do you offer solutions? That is most important. Then the second thing is you have to really put money where your mouth is. Investment. Yes, just now you talk about cost, but we try not to call it a cost, but we call it an investment. There's ROI that's coming back. So the third one is enabler. You need to innovate, because now risk mitigation is not enough. You need to really fast track the innovation, technology, solutions. Without that, you can't move the needle fast enough towards net zero. And last but not least, the last I is actually impact. You must know whatever you do that is positive or negative impact. That is where the beauty of measurement come in. When you measure scope 3, because it it actually contributed by the whole value chain of ecosystem. And we become very calculative now. Everything we use, the energy, light, aircon, everything we calculate very clearly. Otherwise, you don't have the data to help you identify gaps and the hotspots. And without that, you can't come up with solutions or technology. Just to give you one big example, traditionally, construction activities, we have temporary diesel engines to power all the activities round the clock, right? So we have actually successfully supported one of the very good technology. CESS is construction energy system, storage system. CESS, storage system, a lot of acronym. So instead of using diesel, so it actually used, cleaner energy. And because of technology, it actually, the first phase of our pilot in one of our projects helped us to reduce carbon footprint by 85% and also save costs by about 23%. So the way to drive change is there is a business case, whether for procurer or for contractor, and also can reduce carbon footprint. And now we see it as very positively that, we are not at the tipping point, we are at the changing point, because there are a lot of enabler. There are technology, there are solutions, and there is also funds. There are more increased, ESG funds. There are also sustainable finance that can really accelerate action.
I want to just, in the last few minutes, touch on the regulatory framework. We talked about SBTi, there's a carbon disclosure project. Do you each of you think there's a need for sort of a global uniform standard? Is it even possible? And should there be perhaps some distinction or different standards in a region like Asia, where the economies and the countries are not as developed, perhaps in some ways, as the West? What's your sense of that, Jacqueline?
I think to a large extent, harmonization, and as we saw earlier in the taxonomy session, harmonization is going to be so important for leveling the playing field, and to a large extent, there is a need to take into account, differentiated stages of development across the various economies. But where a larger global framework is concerned, there's a very clear need for harmonization. For example, in the aviation sector, there's an ongoing discussion, for example, where in measurement of the aviation sector emissions, in the CORSIA discussions with the UN Aviation Organization, ICAO. And there is, the discussion right now is, what baseline do we take? And of course, different jurisdictions, the progressive ones, are thinking, 2020 will be a great baseline, because basically to start from there would be right in the middle of COVID, where emissions were at an all-time low, and of course the discussion is for the developing economies to look at different, more accommodating baselines. So there's discussions like this that really help us center our focus on what the broader industry journey needs to look like, and that everybody needs to be brought along on that journey. And if not everyone can use the framework to measure, to account for progress, and to reach the final objective, then we're going to not be able to reach the end point together in the same way, and take the same concerted efforts. So to me, harmonization of measurement and accounting is really important in helping us get to the end point together as a global community. Thank you.
Yes, well put. Maurizio, quickly?
Yeah, I mean, as Jacqueline said, from my side, obviously the last call is with the expert, but there are already many standards, many measurement. And if you would ask me, being a multinational, the best will be to have standardization across. So we can talk the same language, we can have the same KPIs. And I think also company reporting sustainability like ours can use a narrative which is clearly understood. Specific to Asia, since there are many global standards, I don't think we need a different standard for Asia. That is the recommendation from the business, because if every country is starting to do their own, it is difficult. And we see already a little bit of a tendency to close in from many countries on many other things, and I wish that on something that is so relevant like our planet, we can have one voice, same standards, same measures, and transparency. So that's what I would say.
Esther?
Well, of course, it's my wish, for the current harmonization of reporting standards to make really a game changer, progress. But being having done 15 reports, I can really say that there's no one size fit all because of the diversity of geographic, markets, sectors, and all that. But I think harmonization is possible because, in fact, before all this harmonization standard, we already created our own blended framework, but it's a painful framework. We have GRI, SASB, CDSB, IRC, TCFD, SDG, GRESB, so you name it, we have it. So now you are already seeing progress. IRC and SASB already merged, and CDSB is as well coming together. So we hope that my hope is on the twin pillar, GRI and SASB, because we need to look at not just the investor, very important, but we also look at the larger stakeholders as well. Yeah, so we have to look at, I wouldn't want to split hair around E, S, or G. I like TCFD because governance, risk management is fundamental. It applies to environmental or social, sustainability. I like the part about, matrix and standards is given, and strategy is very important, because if your ESG is not strategically integrated into your whole business strategy, future-proof your business, and also operations, day-to-day operations, you won't make any progress. So the strategy part is very important. So I'm really hopeful. We just submitted our comments to ISB, the exposure drafts, So hopefully we will see progress, but it won't happen, too soon that you will have one standard that fit the whole world, every industry. I'm not too hopeful for that, but if we are going to the right directions.
You just need to wave your magic wand, Esther, and just make it all happen. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. How about a round of applause for our fantastic panel, Jacqueline, Maurizio, and Esther. I do have a PSA, which is basically we're going to take a short break. So stretch your legs, grab a coffee at the RGE Coffee Bar, and we'll see you back here in 20 minutes. Don't be late. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session.
Thank you very much. Well, this is exciting. I have so many questions.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. It's a pleasure to have you in our London office again, which some of you might know is one of the world's most sustainable office buildings.
Natalie, I want to bring you in on this topic about Russia's war in Ukraine. What impact is that having on the ESG investing space?
Before the war, there were three key drivers for the energy transition, which were regulation, consumer demand, and technological advances. Now there is a fourth element to that, which is energy security and independence.
The invasion of Ukraine should make us even more keen to get to zero carbon, should make us even more keen to make the adaptations. But actually it reminds us energy security is really important.
I would say at the moment, the world is kind of on the cusp of change. On the one hand, there's this significant recognition of the need for our energy to come from renewable sources. So fundamentally, an energy system that doesn't only have a single large centralized grid, but rather has decentralized energy as well, is really crucial to achieving energy security.
And now, Rachel, if you could talk to us a bit about how you've measured Scope 3, what your number is, if it's going up or down.
250 million for Scope 3 emissions.
You're the heavyweight here.
The product in use.
The
the majority of that sits with the use of sold products, so upstream from us in the value chain. Where does the responsibility lie? And for us, we can make the technology as compatible as possible with net zero, but we're incredibly reliant on others in our value chain to help us to get there.
I really enjoy hearing the viewpoints from Julie Brown of Burberry. Her views has been very inspiring.
The fashion world is really at the thick of it when it comes to sustainability and trying to do better. There's suddenly a conscience in fashion and luxury.
I completely agree with you. It's been a challenge, but I think what's really important is everybody has come together to realise just the importance of the planet. Our history, we go back over 160 years, and just over the last 5 years, we set very, very stretching climate change targets, and we've either met or beaten all of them. So fantastic change.
Would you like 10 seconds, the final word?
Somebody wiser than me said, if you can see a wave coming, just stand in front of it. And you don't have to be precisely right. You just need to position yourself so that you're on the right side of that big wave when it happens.
Faber, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, there's so much to talk about in terms of reporting, environmental, societal, and governance reportings at the moment. I would say, pretty erratic and a little bit difficult to get a grapple on. And this is where you, Emmanuel Faber, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean,
Thanks
there's so much to talk about in terms of reporting, environmental, societal and governance reporting is at the moment, I would say, pretty erratic and a little bit difficult to get a grapple on. And this is where you come in trying to unite it, but also make something that's binding rules. What's your main challenge in trying to achieve this goal?
That's a really good question. Thanks for having me first, because today is an important day for us. And I'd say the main challenge is that everybody recognizes that capital markets today do not count everything that counts. And one way or the other, there is an understanding that sustainability issues may be material to investors' decisions on how they allocate capital. And today there is like an alphabet soup of many, many standards and reporting standards, etc. So what the IFRS Foundation has learned from a consultation to its stakeholders is that it could play a role in trying to bring everyone with a unit set of global baseline and building blocks on the themes of environment and social and governance topics in the near future. So that's really what we're doing. And the challenge is, of course, that you need to be as precise as possible for the standard to work, and yet these are topics that by definition, they are not about financials and accounting, so they are more difficult to grab and grasp, and this is where I think that delicate balance needs to happen.
So how do you bring that rigor? Again, I know you're going to consultations. How difficult is it to have a set of rules for financials that also takes account how companies are not doing bad for the environment and society?
Yes, I think first of all, we build from the IASB work, which has the IFRS accounting system, which are adopted by 140 different jurisdictions around the world. And so we really build from that. And then our scope is really about any information about sustainability that is material to investors' decision on capital allocation. And so the rigor is in ensuring, first of all, that we start from the frameworks that have been the most established and solid over the last several years. So we're building from, as an answer to the request from G20 leaders who started with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Information, the TCFD disclosures. So we implement that framework in terms of governance, strategy, risks, targets, and metrics for companies. So that brings solid rigor. We also start from climate, and on climate we start with the greenhouse gas protocol, which is a widely recognized protocol to measure the emissions from entities that we report on our standards.
So you start with climate change.
Yes.
What's next after that, and how do you choose?
Yeah, well, next is going to be a matter of agenda consultation, because the Foundation and the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board, which I represent, will work on the basis of what the market needs are. And the consultation said climate first, but not climate only. So in the second half of this year, after the current consultation on the general requirement and on climate, we'll come back to the market and tell and ask them what next. And actually, already this consultation will, I think, inform us on that as well.
I mean, this is really to have a coherent sustainability reporting standards. And of course, what you come up with will heavily impact the IASB, but the US jurisdiction is not involved in that. So, does the ISSB impact US investors more?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because that's part of the challenges and the opportunities as well. Yeah. I think the fundamental approach to the IASB work so far has really been through a jurisdictional approach. So basically, countries would look at our standards, and in principle, they would be adopting those standards. They look at the next standard, and they use it in their jurisdiction. They make it mandatory. But I think today there is also another opportunity, in particular when it comes to climate, but even beyond that, which is direct market adoption, market participants. So investors, companies that have already embarked, for instance, in the US, there is this fantastic SASB standards that are industry specific and that we expect to consolidate in a few months with them. The SASB standards are used by thousands of companies. So we expect that on top of jurisdictional adoption of our metrics and standards, there could be direct market adoption. And this is probably where there will be a combination with what the SEC has put out for consultation in their ruling, in particular in climate, on which we could be complementary, bringing additional requirements, which in total would fully meet investors' needs when it comes to climate in this particular case.
Do you think the US will adopt your standards? And are there ongoing conversations? I know we're just at the beginning, and it's a very ambitious project.
I don't think the US will adopt from a legal standpoint. I don't think the SEC is going to say, let's take and embark everything. But we are working in order to make sure with jurisdictions, including the US, in order to make sure that our standards are going to be supplemental, complementary, compatible with their rulings. And this is where there is this dual approach of jurisdictional dialogue and engagement and market dialogue and engagement for us.
So the dual approach is also the IASB responsible for financial accounting, and then the ISSB, which you're in charge of, responsible for ESG. So how will the two boards interact?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you. And because I think that's one of the strengths of our proposal, which is to really build from the accounting. So we start there. And that means that our standards are not going to be in a limbo somewhere. In many ways, the first requirement, the general requirement that we're putting up for consultation today is the equivalent of the AIS 1. So it's the foundational work. And a lot of the AIS structure has been put into this so that the connectivity is there. And this is just an illustration of how connected the work of the two boards are going to be, because I'm starting to have questions from preparers and investors as to, well, if you go as far as measuring the material impact on the company's enterprise value of sustainability, maybe at some point it's got to be translated into the financial statements. And that's a very fair question. And I think over time...
Will it?
I think over time that's really a discussion that needs to take place, yes, because obviously if you start having an even clearer structure of reporting on risks and opportunities, for instance, you would expect that the risk committees of boards and the audit committees of corporate boards would like to see that, and if they see that, maybe gradually there will be a clearer topic for providing for that into the account themselves. That's not our remit, but that's clearly where the two boards are going to be very connected to make sure that the reporting is without any disconnect, but any overlap either that is not intended, to make sure that the cost of reporting in total and the readability for investors is going to be optimal.
Do you worry that if the focus is too narrow on financials, you'll miss the bigger picture of just looking at companies that do bad for the environment?
No, I don't worry. Because I don't have to worry, because the remit of the IFRS Foundation is really, it's a general public foundation working for the interest of capital markets. And I personally believe that, if a couple of years' time from now, our standards are moving the prices and moving the capital allocation because of the impact that sustainability topics have on companies, we would do our part in making sure that the climate transition, that is an obvious thing that needs to happen, is done in sync with finance, and finance has got the right tools, the appropriate tools to make their own decisions about it. And that's where we are. Now, it's all good for other people to look at what you're saying, which is the impact on the outside world, which as long as, if that impact is material in a risk, for instance, on reputation or license to operate or regulation or transition risks, because this impact exists, there will be other stakeholders, and that impact becomes material financially for the performance or the prospects of the company, it will be captured in our standards.
So reputation, for example, would be doing business in Russia at the moment.
I guess that's a topic for the moment, yes, yeah.
So how do you view, if you're a financial operator right now, how do you view your scope in longer term? Does it touch really everything that does good for the world? Like, is there an end point to it?
I don't know if there is one, but the one very, very important aspect is in our work is that we are not doing policy. We are not even deciding what is good or what is bad. We are providing the disclosures that allow people to clearly see transparently what the issues are and decide whether they want to do this or not, and what is the cost, the benefit, etc. So we really have to, and we will completely stick to this neutral approach, which but that needs to go through the granularity. I'll just use an example. If in Europe, you've seen the taxonomy that was a few months ago about nuclear being green or blue or whatever it is, etc. And natural gas, is that going to be, and how long for, and under which condition is it going to be green, blue, or whatever? That's the current state of what the policy in Europe is. Maybe
but that's a judgment, isn't it? A judgment at every
and
time.
that's exactly where I'm coming, which is that our metrics would provide transparency through the taxonomy. Right. So we would require companies to disclose their energy mix in Europe. And then it's everybody's decision whether they like nuclear or they don't like nuclear. It's not for us to decide. Right. So it's very important that we disconnect our work from that policy work. It needs to be, it needs to be connected, because we're not operating in a vacuum, but very distinct. And I would like to maybe remind one fundamental thing, which I think is one of the strengths of the IFRS Foundation, is the ISSB is fully independent on its decision-making to adopt a metric or a standard. Fully independent. Not even the trustees can look at what we do when it comes to the standard-setting activities themselves.
But for example, I mean, look, the war in Ukraine is an interesting topic. I know it's a difficult one, but do you have to take a judgment? So even if you're neutral, if you measure it, then it means that you pass some kind of value to it.
Well, I think if there was any metric to be had, is how do you handle conflict-related areas and doing business in those areas? And if in 3 years down the road, through the agenda consultation of the IFRS, the investors and corporates were saying, this is an important topic, then we would have to take it and say, okay, if this is material, you need to disclose something about it. Okay, so let's work about what you need to disclose about it. So it's really this consultation process that makes sure that we are only working and resourcing our work on topics that the market believes is material.
So how fast can this be up and running in terms of a timeline? When are you expecting, what are the big timelines that you're looking at? And you also have to hire quite a lot of people.
Yes, so today is a big milestone, big day, because the exposure drafts are ready for the general requirement, which will be the IFRS S1, Sustainability 1 requirement when it's finalized, and the S2, which is about climate. So we are opening a 120 days period for consultation, and I really encourage the participants of this conference, if they are stakeholders and if they have an opinion, to participate in our consultation. And actually, not only our consultation, but there are other jurisdictions out for consultation right now. Europe will be in a few weeks' time, probably. The US is already. So it's very important to give clarity and coordinated approach, because we will learn a lot. There is a momentum in this that is important to use to make sure that we are as relevant as possible. After that 120 period, which is back end of July, the board, the ISSB, will be quorate and will be working on the feedback. And depending on feedback, we continue to believe that end of this year is probably the right period where we think we can land the general requirement and the climate ready for adoption.
Emmanuel, talk to me about the ESG data field. Why is it so messy? Is there a danger that it's to the company's advantage if it's very difficult to measure? And that's why in 2022, for the moment, it's still a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, it is all over the place. We are trying to do our part, if I may. We have clarified a few very important things. One of the broadest used standard is SASB. It started from the US, but they have a global reach as well. And we are progressing towards the consolidation of the SASB standards and the Integrated Reporting Council, part of the Value Reporting Foundation, both of them. That was announced in the COP26. We also announced a cooperation agreement with GRI, which is interesting because it clarifies the difference between ISSB and GRI. GRI is looking at the impact side, the pillar of impact metrics. We are looking at financial standards. The two, we announced the coordination, the cooperation to reduce the noise of supposedly competing, etc.
But for companies, is it to their advantage? Do they want transparency? Or is it easier for them to hide?
No, I think, again, I think, I'll put it this way. I don't know a CEO of a large corporate, and I know quite a few, that today are not worried about not being able to take sustainability issues as part of their strategy because they are lacking the tools to discuss that with their board and to discuss that with their investors. And they know it's coming. A whole set of industries are facing that wall, that cliff, whatever you want. And whether that's agriculture, because carbon should be in the soil instead of being emitted through regenerative agriculture, you need to change that. You need to invest for that. And for that, you need to have the metrics that allow you to discuss with your investors. So, there will always be, people more or less paying attention to that. But the idea that greenwashing needs to stop is there, and it's big as a consensus.
Even from shareholders? Because you have personal experience where you were doing good, you were trying to do good.
Yeah, but shareholders were fully supportive of that. The issue was a board issue, which again I think addresses why the TCFD recommendations are so important, because they start with governance. The hard questions will be asked. Is your board spending enough time on climate? Is your board equipped with the expertise that it needs to do that? And is your board taking management accountable for what they do on climate? These are the questions. And so that's where I think that I can say that many, many investors realize that it is there. And I would add one very important thing, which is that beyond the retail, the institutional investors, the other providers of capital that are banks, for instance, they have the pressure from the central banks. Many central banks now have climate as part of their mandate for financial stability. And the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, has also a committee that deals with climate. And they need to be seeing through the portfolios where the decarbonation of the portfolio happen. So whether you like it or not, whether that's from bottom or from up, many sectors are under pressure to be able to report, in an appropriate manner about those sustainability issues.
Emmanuel, we have a lot of chief executives watching. Given your personal experience, what would you say to a chief executive who wants to do good but is concerned about going too far and losing either the board or the shareholder base?
Very simple, unfortunately. Adopt our standards, because those standards are based on a consultation where 700 market participants took place, which means thousands of participants to say, we need a climate standard first, and we need it fast. So we are in this momentum. I can say, and I can testify, talking to many of CEOs now, many investors as well, that they are expecting that metric.
Welcome back from the break. Come back in, grab your seats. Hope you got a chance to have a nice cup of coffee, a snack. Come back in. We've got a great afternoon and rest of the day of programming for you right now. So we want to keep hearing from you. Please keep submitting those questions via the QR code on your badge. Keep sending them in if you're watching virtually. We also want to keep hearing from you on social media. So make sure you're using the hashtag #SustainableBizSummit. We'd love to hear what you think of the conversations, what you think of the speakers so far. We have a great couple of sessions coming up for you after this. We're going to be talking about circular economy. We're going to be talking about biodiversity. We're going to talk about social purpose. We've got some great one-on-one interviews. So lots more to come with the program. And so to kick off our second half here, I'd like to bring to the stage Fauzia Marzouki from Bloomberg NEF. She's going to give us a great presentation on what to expect for net zero in Asia. Fauzia, stage is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here. So I only know how to share screens now, so this is going to be a bit interesting with the clicker. So my name is Faust, and I'm part of the Bloomberg NEF team, and we're the primary energy research division for Bloomberg. We look at commodity markets and the technologies driving the energy transition. So, there's been a whole host and flurry of net zero proclamations, targets, aspirations, so much that 90% of greenhouse gas emissions are now covered by some form of decarbonization target. How does that all look? Well, for us here in Asia, we're all aligned on decarbonization largely, be it a carbon neutrality target or an actual net zero target, but all heading in the right direction. How these countries are going to make it to net zero will vary dramatically with their local circumstances that are unique to each and every one of those markets. How have we been making strides, though? Well, our Bloomberg NEF analysis shows that the policies implemented aren't quite there yet to plausibly achieve deep decarbonization as per what some of the countries have been aspiring to. We have an annual zero carbon policy scoreboard, which evaluates and ranks policies for the G20 countries. And this scoreboard examines six major areas where policymakers can address lowering and limiting CO2 emissions. This is the power sector, low carbon fuels, CCUS, transport, buildings, industry, and circular economy. Largely, the power sector has been doing has made the most strides across the board. This is very much sort of countries committing to bolder interim targets for adding renewable capacity in line with their net zero targets. They vary with country. For example, places like the US and Japan, they're a little bit off from their renewable targets, but places like Australia, for example, have actually met their renewable capacity targets a decade before their target. Everything else, largely still falling behind. And with regards to low carbon fuels, at least half of these countries have also enacted or at least released some kind of low carbon hydrogen strategy associated with it. These policies were based on 2021 enacted policies. So ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy security and interdependence is front and center again. But there's no reason why sort of cutting GHG emissions can't go hand in hand with some of this in terms of rolling out more renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency in these countries. It is a complex subject, though, and it's a multi-decade problem that we're going to have to be dealing with here. So one of the initiatives that Bloomberg has done is the Net Zero Pathfinders. This is a public resource, and it hopes to give insight to policymakers on how to design and implement decarbonization strategies today for cities, for countries, etc. Managing this in 4, shall we say, more palatable pillars for net zero. And this is where we'll be expecting, when we see what's going to happen in Asia, it's going to fall in any of these 4 particular pillars. The first pillar is accelerating the deployment of mature climate solutions. Straightforward enough, that's renewable energy. So what we saw in BNEF's energy transition investment trends last year was that renewable energy investments still lead the way, completely dominates it. So this is solar, wind, other renewables, etc. That came to a record new of 366 billion committed last year. The second largest sector was electrified transport. So this includes EVs and the associated infrastructure. This came up to 273 billion invested. Asia is still king, obviously, and China leads the way with that. The single largest country for energy transition investment that we captured at 266 billion last year. So Asia-Pacific countries now hold 4 of the top 10 countries in terms of highest energy investments in energy transition technologies or sectors. So this is India and South Korea now joining the likes of China and Japan. For all of these countries, it's the same story about investing in the more mature technologies of renewables and EVs, whereas newer technologies are still falling behind to a certain extent. And the scale is just not comparable at this stage for mature clean technologies versus others. But it's these new technologies which are going to help us reach deep decarbonization in those hard-to-abate sectors. And for us at Bloomberg NEF, we see hydrogen and CCUS being those 2 critical technologies for the next phase of decarbonization. Now, hydrogen may not be playing a big role in abatement in the 2020s, but it is going to play a critical role after 2030 if we want to be on track for net zero, if we want to even make it to net zero. So this is why Korea's latest hydrogen plan has doubled their 2030 hydrogen projections. This is why shipyards in Japan are not making LNG carriers anymore. They're making ammonia carriers and LH2 carriers. And similarly, and in China, the city of Ordos, a small city in China's Inner Mongolia province, plans to produce 1 million metric tons of green hydrogen by the end of the decade. That is actually the same, that can actually meet 5% of the EU's targeted consumption for 2030 of green hydrogen. So you imagine the scale that's going to come out of Asia for here. With regards to CCUS, this is sort of the storing and giving new life to that CO2 that's been captured. So we're going to have a session on circular economy later, but this is very much upcycling the carbon that we try to capture. Those technologies are a bit more known to us. We just need to manage the scale of it in the next 10 years to actually make them competitive. we can't take our eye off some of the more innovative, more climate solutions. So every year, Bloomberg NEF launches the Pioneers Initiatives, where we're looking for startup companies and new innovative technologies that will accelerate the low carbon transition, or perhaps even in some cases halt climate change, excuse me. The three challenges that we chose this year were scaling carbon removal, providing 24/7, around-the-clock clean power, and also decarbonizing aviation. We heard a little bit about from Boeing earlier. So these three technologies are new, innovative. This is the stuff like you hear, like direct air capture. The reason we see that this is important is just curbing emissions is one thing, but we're realizing more and more that actually getting rid of the CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be critical in making sure that global warming actually does stay below the 1.5 degrees. With regards to, the third pillar is very much just curbing the role of fossil fuels. It's a known strategy, it's a widely accepted strategy, however, the most perhaps politically difficult to do. There are many ways for us to do that, and many ways that Asia will look to do this. You can outright phase out coal, just a direct, I'm closing that coal plant. However, perhaps regrettably, there's still at least 40 countries that have active coal capacity that have not pledged any kind of phase out for coal. The other thing is a carbon price mechanism to actually penalize fossil fuel generation. This is very much gaining track, especially the cap and trade mechanism. So you've got a tax, people don't like the word tax, but carbon tax or a carbon market mechanism, ETS. The biggest one now that we're looking at is China, previously Korea, and a small one in New Zealand, but definitely something that's gaining traction. The very last component or strategy is, why all of you are here today, isn't it? It's very much about providing the enablers for this energy transition. It's about getting the financial institutions to be aligned with the net zero targets. It's about getting the communities and everybody on board with this. The benefits of a low carbon transition need to be managed so that they are inclusive for everybody. So when we transition the global economy from high carbon assets to the low carbon alternatives, we need to make sure that the workers, communities are all supported with this. And that's going to be a coordinated effort by all stakeholders, government, businesses, coordination, to come up to have this, as some of the other panelists have talked about earlier, is the just transition. Perhaps one of the most important things, the main things that COP27 in Egypt will bring up is who's going to pay for this. I don't think anyone has a solution for that, but maybe those are the conversations that we'll be talking about here today. The net zero. So how net zero is actually going to look for each and every one of the countries is, as I mentioned, going to be different. And we at Bloomberg NEF, we will be publishing our new energy outlook later this year, which is going to chart the various net zero pathways for some of our tier 1 countries and what that might look like, what are the different technologies and baskets of policies that they're going to need to enact in order to make that happen. So do look out for that, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, I'm going to pass it over back to Lauren, or the next panel. Thank you so much.
Please welcome to the stage Joyce Tay, Chief Strategy Officer, StartupX, and Geoffrey Yeo, Assistant CEO, Urban Solutions, Sustainability and Enterprise Finance at Enterprise Singapore, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Ishika Mukherjee.
Hello, everyone. I hope your energy levels are as sustainable as the topics of this conference as we head into this panel about waste and the circular economy. So let's get right into it. Singapore generated about 6.94 million tons of solid waste last year, according to the National Environment Agency. And just about more than half of this was recycled. The recycling rate for plastic was 6% last year. So, Geoffrey, if I can ask you, how big is Singapore's waste problem at this point, and what is the government doing about moving from a linear to a circular economy?
Yeah, thanks, Ishika, for the question. I think as a small, low-lying country, definitely circularity and closing the waste loop is a key strategic priority for Singapore. And the government has been looking at circularity, the green economy for some time. I think, in fact, the water story is a good example, right? I think our Public Utilities Board has done a great job in closing the water loop by looking at new technologies like new water, desalination. But beyond water, I think there are new constraints. And plastic waste, e-waste, I think these are the new challenges that we need to deal with. And the Singapore government has put in place certain plans and strategies to deal with this. I think a good milestone in our circular economy journey is the launch of the Zero Waste Master Plan back in 2019. And essentially that plan looks at and identified key waste streams, food waste, plastic waste, e-waste, as you mentioned, and really how do we tackle these waste streams and how do we reduce the waste that goes to our landfills. So that's the Zero Waste Master Plan, and I think more recently, last year the government announced the Singapore Green Plan. And as part of that plan, which basically is a whole of government plan towards sustainable development, there are strategies and pillars that looks at circularity. How do we deal with our waste streams? How do we promote sustainable living through recycling and better managing our waste resources?
Joyce, if I could bring you in at this point, you've helped launch quite a few accelerators around sustainability, smart cities across Southeast Asia. Can you tell us about Hyperscale and StartupX and what work you're doing in that space?
Yeah, so StartupX, we are an innovation company and we work with partners, we work with government agencies and corporates to basically drive innovation with startups. And part of what we do then is launching accelerators across different verticals. And one of the very big areas then is in sustainability. So we are working with Geoffrey's team to look at waste management, and we are working with startups from all around the globe that are tackling plastic waste and e-waste, both upstream and downstream across the entire waste value chain. We want to be able to actually work with them and get them to work with our partners to drive more innovation in the waste sector.
What kinds of solutions have you come across at this point in the waste tech space?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So if you look at across the entire waste value chain, the waste sector is one where it requires sometimes quite deep-seated expertise. Yeah. And it's hard for any young startup founder to come in and say, I want to build great things in the waste sector, because they might lack the domain expertise to actually do more things in this space. So a lot of them, a lot of the startups that we work with, they concentrate upstream, which is looking at product redesign, alternative packaging, sustainable packaging, and so on. But we also do come across quite a number of maybe founders that are a little bit more mature, that have a number of years in the waste sector, and they are able to see what are the pain points in these sectors, and they want to tackle that. So you do see companies that are tackling much further downstream, that are looking at basically waste treatment, waste sorting, automated sorting, and so on, that are actually interested to work with the waste managers, incumbent waste managers, to collaborate and do more in this space.
I guess. Oh, would you like to add?
No, I was just going to jump in quickly, and I think beyond what Joyce mentioned, I think definitely we see a shift towards just demand for simple waste management solutions, right? Towards really circular solutions, and I think what's quite in demand, especially in our region, is towards areas like resource circularity. How do we close the waste loop? How do we create more resilient resources? And we see technologies and companies within some of these technologies. Yeah.
So I suppose as a government, you're going to have to deal with a lot of competing interests, especially as ESG becomes a bigger part of many discussions that you're having. How much is the government really willing to, allocate to the circular economy right now?
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't put a specific number, but if I just reference Singapore government's research, innovation, and enterprise strategy and budget, right? Almost, I think, 400 million has been allocated towards decarbonization and circularity, and there is an 80 million sort of funding for a close the loop sort of initiative as well. So I think there's adequate monies that are being channeled towards this area. Yeah.
I mean, we're in really very early stages right now when it comes to transitioning to a circular economy. As a startup, practically, as a startup founder, what can I do in terms of working with the government in Singapore or working with big businesses here in the country to help them make that transition?
Can I take this?
You can go first.
Well, I think the role of partnerships is definitely critical in this transition towards a circular economy. And the partnerships can come in the form of public-private partnerships, as well as collaborations between large corporates, MNCs, and small companies, SMEs and startups. And I think the government plays a role not just in funding, right, but also in creating these platforms. As an example, Enterprise Singapore, we have launched a series of sustainability open innovation challenges that really works with and identifies corporates, get them to identify their challenge statements, and work with startups to sort of co-create and innovate circular solutions. And in these platforms, I think that's where the startups can leverage the resources of the MNCs and the corporates, whether it's in funding, mentorship, test bedding facilities, as an example.
Yeah. So if so we are part of an alliance called the Sustainability and Innovation Alliance. The alliance has just celebrated its first year anniversary. And at the core of the alliance, and there's about 700 plus members and advocates from all around the world that's a part of this alliance. And at the very core of it is the idea that collaboration is the way to go for sustainable innovation. It doesn't matter whether you are a startup founder or an investor or corporate innovator or regulator. The core of it is not about disrupting. It's actually about collaborating together so that we can drive more sustainable innovation. And I think, whether you are an academic that's trying to create research in this space, or you're a startup founder that's trying to build more sustainable solutions, you have to learn to figure out how to actually work with the regulators better. You have to learn how to work with the corporates better. And we need to establish what is that easier framework for people to collaborate better so that they can bring together more sustainable practices. And that's what we try to do. Through the accelerator, then, the idea is that at the end of the day, we want to be able to connect the startup founders and the solutions that they have together with the waste management incumbents so that they can actually collaborate and they can actually pilot their solutions together in the industry. And the way that we want to do it is to facilitate an easier way and an easier approach to do that. So I think the bottom line is understanding it from a collaboration perspective, and then things can flow better.
Which sectors are sort of facing the most pressure right now in terms of making that transition? In Singapore or in Southeast Asia?
The corporates are facing a lot of the pressure.
Yeah, which industries?
Which industries? Yeah. I do think overall there are, well, if you look at it from, let's say, the consumer's consciousness about things, more and more consumers are demanding that the brands that they purchase from, they have to be sustainable. And because of that, and at the same time, then there are also the regulators, and maybe Geoffrey is best placed to answer this. There are also the regulators who are saying, hey, there are certain areas. For example, if you are an e-waste producer, you have to be a lot more uptight about how you are generating all of these waste and what you're doing about it, and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, they are also facing pressure from their shareholders who say, hey, we have to look at the bottom line. When we introduce sustainable practices, or when we, do something, that's in the sustainability domain, what does it mean for our bottom line? And also, what does it mean for our brand image? So there are definitely different industries. I would say right now in Singapore, the hardware companies, for example, is one of the industries that are, a little bit more maybe conscious about the kind of waste that they are generating. Then also, if you look at real estate players, facilities management, hotels, and so on, that's also another industry that is also starting to be a lot more conscious about, for example, the waste that they create.
Yeah, and just to add on that, you mentioned regulation. So, of course, for specific areas where there is a need to intervene, I think in e-waste, extended producer responsibility frameworks, right, regulations have been put in place really to sort of put the onus on the producers to be more mindful of the e-waste that they create. And that's one key area. And the idea, of course, is to extend this to other waste streams. I think packaging is another a key area, which basically cuts across many different industries and sectors as well, which the government is trying to address. Yeah.
Okay, I think at this point we can bring up the Twitter poll that we had in the lead up to the summit, where we asked the Twitterverse, has the pandemic really helped or hurt Asia's move towards transitioning from a linear to a circular economy? And if we could bring the results up, that would be great. But what we found was that 81.5% of the Twitterverse actually said it hurt the move, whereas 18.5% said it helped. Unsurprising, right? I think at this point it would be nice to talk about the challenges in terms of doing this transition. So this involves a lot of costs for a company to bear, thinking about the materials they're using for their products, how to recycle it, how to reduce waste. How are they sort of navigating that at this point?
Well, maybe I'll cover it from maybe the consumer's perspective, because we do work with a lot of young startup founders. So at the height of the pandemic, we ran a hackathon where we actually invited all of these young participants to basically tackle challenges that were of very big issues to youth in Singapore today. And sustainability was one of the areas, future of work was one of the areas, and not surprisingly, most of them choose to work on future of work. It's almost as though, the past few years where people were very passionate about sustainability and they want to do more in this space, they put that aside because their most immediate concerns is their bread and butter.
Yeah.
And I think if you extrapolate that to the corporates, it's the same thing. Making sure that the business is secure, it's way more important, and because they have employees, they have so much considerations to think about before sustainability.
Right.
That has become something of an afterthought. I think things are changing, and we see through our conversations with our partners that a lot of these are coming back. There are net zero targets that a lot of companies have set, by 2050, by 2030, and at the back of their minds, they do understand that is something that they have to work towards. But it's true, I do think that, as per the Twitter poll, it's definitely hurt the momentum that we had been on prior to the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both hurt and helped, right? I think definitely the COVID and the pandemic resulted in companies taking their eye off that objective and really trying to survive and address business costs. But at the same time, I think during the pandemic, it has also created an awareness on the challenges that we faced in managing our waste. I think that there was a report that was talking about how COVID actually impacted the waste sector, because there's an increased frequency of waste, there's a shift towards municipal versus industrial waste, etc. And I think that's also the period where we see a lot of governments and industries realizing the waste problem, and that action needs to be taken. And basically that creates opportunities for economic opportunities and businesses, right? I think the challenges that businesses will face really depends on whether there are companies that are looking to adopt solutions and to be more sustainable and to be more circular, and different set of challenges that are faced for companies looking to innovate, right? I think for the ones that are looking to transit and be more circular in their practices, they're too used to the linear business model. I think there's a lack of awareness about circularity and the different business models. And the other hurdle really is the cost for them to adopt some of these solutions. For companies and startups that we work with that are looking to innovate and develop solutions, I think the typical R&D and product development risk remains. But I think there is that high investment cost that's required and a lot of uncertainty on whether these solutions will actually be adopted in the industry.
Right.
Yeah.
So as an investor, how can an investor tap this space right now? And greenwashing is such a big theme. How do they avoid that? Joyce, would you like to go?
I think the circularity space is one that maybe many investors are still, I think, quite unsure about, because investors at the end of the day, they are looking at the ROI for their investments, and sometimes it's hard to sort of look at a circularity company and think about what that multiple could be if they invest in these companies. We often work with a lot of investors who tell us that they don't quite understand how to do the due diligence around these companies. There's not enough precedence in Asia as compared to, let's say, in Europe or US, for them to understand, how to best invest in these companies. At the same time, we do see, right now with hyperscale, we're working with a number of impact investors that we are hoping at the end of the accelerator, some of the startups that come out through the accelerator could be potential investments for these investors. And at the same time, we are hoping to create more education for investors to sort of understand how they can be a part of sustainability investing. But it takes time to educate. And it takes time for, I think there is interest. There's interest from the family offices, there's interest from the corporate investors, there's interest from the venture capital companies. It's more about the education that needs to be there for them to understand how to invest in this space. A lot more investors now have a part dedicated to ESG investing. It could be virtue signaling, but at the same time, it also might mean that they are more passionate and more interested to look at this space, but it will take some time.
From Enterprise Singapore's perspective, we are an enterprise development agency, so we would engage and support companies in the circular solutions or circular economy regardless of the matrices. But we do have an investment arm, Seeds Capital, that invests in tech startups, including areas within the circular economy and sustainability. We are more a thematic investor rather than a impact investor, so we don't really rely on certain investment matrices. But we do look at opportunities, areas within water monitoring and solutions, energy, renewable energy, food technologies. And a lot of these areas are also aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, right, as thematics. One point, of course, is that we do invest alongside private sector venture capitalists, a number of them, and we're beginning to see more VCs that are more impact-focused and very focused on sustainability. And each of them have their own matrices that they rely on. Within our ecosystem, investors like Trirac, Wavemaker Impact, Emerald Ventures in the area of water, right? So these are partners that we invest alongside to deploy investments into startups in the space.
Okay. Yeah. I think we can take one question at this point. There's one coming in about S&G seeming to play just supporting roles for E. At the end of the day, is it all about the E, or do the social and governance side of things deserve more attention? Why are we so focused on the environment, essentially?
Well, maybe I'll jump in on this. No, I think eventually we would need to look at all three aspects, right? Environment, social, governance. I think right now, of course, the environmental issues are probably a lot more evident and pressing, right? With all the reports on the waste generation, I think the stats like World Bank's statistics that our global waste is going to increase by 70% by 2050. I think all this just creates a focus in this environmental area. And of course, the impact on climate change. Measurability, I think, is another reason that I'm hearing, right? It's a lot easier to measure and quantify the impact on the environmental space as compared to the social and governance. So perhaps that's why there is an increased focus on the environmental side. And of course, with green finance picking up steam amongst regulators as well as the financiers. But I do think that the social and governance part are just as important. Yeah.
Okay. Joyce, if I could come back to... Sorry, would you like to add something to this?
Well, I think just to sort of maybe give a little bit of perspective is that we all live on one Earth, and we all have just one Earth to care about. But when it comes to the S, depending on which region of the world you are in, the S is very different. The S concerns and issues that you have is very different. And so it's easier to unite people for that E than the S. I think that's why.
Okay, I want to come back to the point of multiples. How much are investors willing to pay up for waste technologies at this point? What are the multiples you're seeing in Europe or the US?
Well, if you compare Asia versus the West, I think it's still quite different. A lot more of the capital that impact investors are deploying right now are still in the early stage side of things, because it is still very nascent in Asia. You do have a lot more companies that are investing in, let's say, seed to Series A. But in US and in Europe, then you have a lot more growth stage capital that's deploying funds towards circularity companies. And it's simply a matter of just the fact that we are still in a very nascent stage.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for now, but thank you very much for joining me today, Geoffrey and Joyce. It was great talking to you, and all the best to the next panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Laura Bosk, Sustainable Investing Specialist at Robico, and Kelvin Chu, Founder and Principal at Silver Strand Capital, and Anderson Tanoto, Managing Director at RGE, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisco.
Everybody, and welcome to Laura and Kelvin and Anderson. I won't get too bogged down in introductions, but I think you know our fine panelists here. I do want to just note Anderson from RGE, from which Anderson hails, is a presenting sponsor of the summit, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Michelle.
And I want to start off, I mean, investing in biodiversity is such an interesting topic to me because it does kind of go a layer down from these broad discussions that we've been having. And I think it kind of marries these two worlds. You know, I was the kind of kid that went down to my childhood basement and pored over National Geographic's 30-year-old issues. And today I sometimes live in a cold world of economic data and investing, which we'll talk about today. So part of what we're trying to do here is marry those two worlds and talk about, importantly, why it matters. So I just want to, coming from the economy world of reporting, I want to start out with a stat. Investing to protect biodiversity in Southeast Asia alone could mean more than $2.19 trillion in benefits a year, according to the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. So just to sort of start to frame the discussion, I don't want to get too bogged down in definitions, and we had a whole great panel on taxonomies earlier this morning, but if we could just start by sort of framing what we're going to talk about today. What do we talk about when we talk about biodiversity? And specifically for Anderson, in the corporate world, making that case has become a bit complicated, right? And so I want to hear from you. What do all these definitions swirling around mean for trying to define success in one kind of collective way? So maybe you can start and then we can
Sure. Michelle, thank you again, and good morning, everyone. Biodiversity is a very interesting topic because in the environmental side, everyone's talking about carbon, but people forget that carbon is something that you cannot see. Biodiversity, you can, right? And a big part of carbon is biodiversity. There are ecosystem services that is provided through biodiversity. So I'm a little bit earlier on in this sustainability space. In 2015, in COP21 in Paris, actually, our company, which is a plantation but manufacturing also company, we committed 1-for-1. So 1 hectare of conservation and restoration for every hectare of plantation we have. So in this 7-year journey, we've invested over $100 million, and we have about 400,000 hectares of conservation and restoration. Just to put that into perspective, it's about 6 times the size of Singapore. And we never started this project as a carbon project. We actually genuinely focused on the biodiversity element. But now it has paid off. In the last 2 years, the carbon market has really picked up and able to put $1 on a standing forest, right? So this is very, very interesting. And it went through a verified carbon unit audit with Verra standards. And last year, it was actually issued in the Verra online platform. It's the largest carbon project in the world right now. 350 million tons of avoided emissions and about 6.7 million tons of avoided emissions annually, a total 350 million. So I think biodiversity as a topic will be intertwined with carbon, and it has a huge role to play because we need to protect what we can see and what we can feel so that we can appreciate the carbon.
It's easier to kind of conceptualize sometimes than carbon in some ways. Laura and Kelvin, how do you see this conversation framed?
Yes, from the financial industry perspective, he already mentioned that what we get from nature is ecosystem services, right? And those are really underpinning all the support for our economic activities and our life on Earth, essentially. So it's estimated that actually half of global GDP depends on these natural services that we get from biodiversity. And that figure is actually higher here in Asia Pacific. 2/3 of the regional GDP strongly depend on these natural services that we get from ecosystems. And the challenge that we see is a strong decline on the quality of these ecosystem services and also erosion of the amount of species that we have on Earth. And that's certainly worrisome. And in fact, tomorrow is already Earth Overshoot Day for 2022. That means that from tomorrow onwards, we're indebted to nature. We're using more resources than what nature can actually regenerate within a year. So that's very fundamental also for the financial industry to understand that we need to take into account the actual value of nature and integrate that in the way that we value the investee companies that we want to include in our portfolios and also in the way that we allocate capital.
Hey, Calvin?
Yeah, that's a great summary. Not too much to add. I would say maybe two things. One is that a graphic maybe helps. If you imagine a wedding cake where the economy wholly exists within society and society wholly exists within the biosphere. Right? This is a UN graph. That really shows, we're really dependent on biodiversity for our survival. So it's not just nice to have. And then the second thing is, if you were to sum up the crisis in a sentence, it is that for too long, we collectively have put a zero price on nature, despite the positive ecosystem services. Sometimes even a negative price. We've subsidized the destruction of nature. And so that has to stop.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate the examples especially, and also kind of your framing of the dependence that we have, and also in economic terms. So we'll move kind of into the investing bit, but I do want to kind of branch off from this just a little for 1 second on the links to climate change. I mean, we talk about biodiversity and climate change having some sort of relationship here. I want to particularly ask about this because we heard recently Singapore Ambassador at Large, Tommy Koh, talking about how because we're missing the program on biodiversity, we're not able to do as much as we should on climate change. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you kind of link these two broad issues?
Well, I think you cannot solve one without taking the other into account, essentially. So climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And at the same time, nature is really our greatest ally to combat climate change. So it's estimated that 30% of the climate mitigation potential will come from nature globally. Just to give you an example, since pre-industrial levels, half of all the carbon that we emitted into the atmosphere has been captured by natural sinks like forests, oceans, and other ecosystems. So it's really important to understand that we need to actively work to protect ecosystems, to regenerate those that have been degraded, and also allocate capital in a way that we are supporting those companies that are working towards that end goal.
Yeah, I think the key question here really is, what are the solutions which can simultaneously address both crises together? And the answer, in short, is nature-based climate solutions. The protection and restoration of important natural habitats, but also the management of working agricultural lands, where we get to work with nature rather than against nature. Maybe two things I'll highlight. One is that in terms of climate finance, only 2% so far goes to nature-based solutions. So that's very low, and we need that to increase. And that's because we need a more enabling environment. We also need better science, better understanding. For example, in seagrass now, we're using biomass as a proxy for how much carbon is sequestered, but that's actually not true. A better indicator is chlorophyll, because if the seagrass is brown, it might be emitting carbon. So understanding the science better is very important. And so that's what we're working on. But last point is, it's already a lot better than a decade or two ago, where conservation was entirely a philanthropic endeavor. But now we have financially sustainable models where we can start conservation, and so it's changing in the right direction.
2% is better than zero, right?
I want to build on Kevin's point, which is absolutely, mind-boggling. When I was in COP21 in Paris, 2015, I was speaking about biodiversity. There was literally 30 people, all practitioners, No, not a single finance or from other industries, right? And now, 2022, 7 years later, biodiversity is being spoken in this Bloomberg conference. So that shows the importance of biodiversity. Second, the breakthrough of paying for standing forests. To me, that is a huge breakthrough, because this verified carbon unit concept, which is the voluntary carbon market, allows you to put $1 on carbon that is actually standing. And this is a very, very, very powerful concept, because if you just take a step back, all the corporates in the world right now are committing to net zero emissions, including Singapore. Not zero emissions, but net zero emissions. So what does that really mean? It means that you have to offset. Of course, you have to reduce first and then offset. So this carbon market that is really evolving very quickly, I think is one of the largest breakthrough to actually protecting biodiversity. Of course, then you have to say, how do you ensure that the carbon market has integrity? How do you ensure the carbon market is traceable? And how do you then make sure that the carbon market actually really protects the forest? So I think nature-based climate solutions, actually our company, we're working closely with NUS, Nature-Based Climate Solutions Center with Prof. Ko Lian Ping, the Singapore government as well, to actually build a digital twin. So what we're trying to say is, to track the standing forest right now, it takes auditors to go into the ground and actually spend months to actually check whether the biodiversity is still there. But now using Landsat images, you're able to build a digital twin of the forest online, and you can open up this platform for funders and other investors to actually have access to. So really using technology, building on the carbon market, and at the heart of it is really protecting the forest to stay as what it is at this point in time.
So you neatly kind of brought those two worlds together, and I think all three of you have made the strong economic and human case for why we get involved in biodiversity. So I want to talk a little bit more about the investor side. I mean, investors aren't all bleeding heart environmentalists. I mean, what is the case that you make? What is the case that you see for, the bottom line for investing in biodiversity, helping financial portfolios? What are those channels where you see that most obvious? Maybe Laura, you can start with that.
Yeah, so essentially the way that we look at it is that companies are exposed to nature-related risks, and I believe Anderson will be able to sort of elaborate on that later on. But there are two main channels in which they are exposed to these risks. So on one hand, through exposure of physical risks. So basically companies depending on these ecosystem services to be able to operate. So let's think about a palm oil producer. They need good quality of the soil, low level of land degradation, availability of water to irrigate the crops. So fundamental service that we get from nature, right? So that's one angle. And then the other one is more on the transition risks. So that's more looking at how companies are actually impacting the key drivers of biodiversity loss. So for example, land use change is one of the key issues in eroding terrestrial ecosystems. So companies in the agricultural sector will really have to take into account how they are managing the risks around exposure to deforestation across their supply chain to make sure that they don't face issues in selling their products in countries where they are implementing restrictions in importing commodities linked to deforestation. So those are the ways that we look at it. And what we've done at Robeco is actually consolidate an internal biodiversity task force, and we have 2 biodiversity specialists working full-time on this, really trying to outline how can we integrate these nature-related risks in the way that we evaluate companies. So the first step that we took already last year was to do a sector-level analysis and understand which sectors we have the highest exposure to and have those clear impact on biodiversity loss drivers. And we found out that 30% of our assets under management are actually linked to sectors highly impacting the drivers of biodiversity loss, mainly land use change. So you can think of agricultural, forestry, but also apparel, for instance, and they're dependent on natural fibers for the production. So that was just a step to get that sort of heat map and understand where are the key risks across our portfolios. And now what we're working on is actually developing a framework to really understand and better capture at the company level how can we take into account all these nature-related risks in the way that we assess the sustainability performance of those companies in our portfolios.
So a lot of it too is about the risk side. A lot of what you've outlined is more kind of defensive in terms of mitigating, legislation, maybe regulation that's coming down the line. Okay. Colin or Anderson?
Yeah, I mean, as an impact investor, we look at more perhaps the opportunities related to this. In terms of the risks, Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, TNFD, that's very important. Just a few comments. It's voluntary. We would like to see it go mandatory in the future. That would be great. And also, it needs to be sped up a bit.
Maybe I chime in a little bit from the biodiversity topic wasn't a large one in the last few years. It was very driven by carbon and climate and reduction of emissions. But last year, we issued quite a large sustainability linked loan, one of the largest in Singapore, $1.65 billion last year. And we actually tied a few KPIs specifically on biodiversity. Actually, it was two KPIs. One is 0% of biodiversity loss. And if there's any loss, we have to restore or conserve it back. And second is additional conservation gains, actually. So when we first introduced this KPI to the syndicate loan banks, actually they were actually surprised, because most of the KPIs within companies are actually focused on emissions reductions and on the social side. So again, it's really putting money in the game. I mean, if we miss that KPI, it's 5 bips. It is money, right? So in the end, is how do you share that risk with companies? How do you align interest? People think sustainability-linked loan is just a loan. Actually, it was incredible as a corporate because it aligned our whole organization. The banking team, the operational team, the sustainability team, the finance team actually had to sit down together for days, try to figure out some of these KPIs. Because previously, in a voluntary commitment situation, you have the sustainability and the CEOs making decisions. But if it's KPI linked to actually real numbers, everyone gets aligned. So I think bankers and financiers, I think small little things makes a huge difference for companies. I think most loans in this region should be SLL eventually. And I think managing risk is about aligning interests. So if there's that biodiversity loss for the companies, the company must take action on the ground. And I think that's really, I think, coming from the company side, it's very important for us to actually be able to act on the ground and make a difference.
I want to follow up on that just from the corporate perspective, because you kind of addressed, Anderson, a lot of the investment side of things and where they're putting their money. If you think about it from the millennial generation perspective, I mean, we hear a lot about how millennials are putting their spending toward companies and other goods and services that share their values. Yeah. I mean, do you see this playing out as one of the main corporate motives to kind of respond to that generation's needs? Or are there other motives that you see, and particularly on biodiversity, where companies are feeling the need to get involved?
So 3 points on that. I think first, why the millennial generation cares, because they're young. And if climate change is going to happen, it's going to happen maybe 30, 40 years down the road. And we're going to bear the brunt of the climate change, right? So that's first. Second is actually a very crowded space, truth be told. Yeah? There are a lot of products that are being sold in the market, really using sustainability advertisements or marketing tools. But if you dig deeper, actually a lot of it's the packaging side. I mean, the inside is actually still fundamentally having a lot of issues. So there's a lot of noise. And I realized that the next generation now, like my generation, 30-something, we have to ask a lot of questions. And actually, I get a little bit cynical with a lot of the sustainability products, right? Last but not least, actually, it's sustainability should not only be for the elites. Sustainability should not only be for the developed countries, right? I'm Indonesian. I grew up in Indonesia. I spent some time in Singapore as well. But our goal is to really make sustainability widespread, accessible to everyone, and that's how you move the needle. So at least as a young person, I hope that sustainability is accessible to all, and that requires structural changes.
Laura and Kelvin, do you have any thoughts on what the motives you see from the company side in terms of getting involved in biodiversity?
Want to go first?
No, I think absolutely Anderson highlighted very good points here, right? We really have to dig deep as investors to make sure that it is not greenwashing, that they have the right incentives deep down. So.
Yeah, and what we've seen through our stewardship work with our investee companies, talking about the importance of biodiversity for their bottom line and for their businesses, is that they're starting to understand how they are being exposed to these nature-related risks. But to some extent, they don't really see the market push yet happening. So for example, we've been doing quite some engagement with soy producers and soy traders, And they still see that the buyers are not asking for deforestation-free soy yet, not at large volumes. So there is a challenge there on how do you align the interest of all stakeholders to really make sure that you can move the needle. And I think there is certainly at the moment like increasing awareness about the importance of working around biodiversity laws and taking that into account in the way that we build our business strategies or investment strategies as well. But there is still more work to be done, right? And that's why we're here today, to sort of raise awareness and make sure that everyone in their different roles from a stakeholder perspective, in public policy, government, companies or investors, they really take their ownership as well on how to solve this issue.
You get that holistic approach you're talking about. I want to go back to something Anderson said earlier about, well, we were talking about marrying these two worlds of people on the ground and those investors. And I want to focus, Calvin, I mean, we're talking about all these different types of stakeholders. We haven't talked about so much the NGOs, the people on the ground who are living and breathing this, as Anderson said, this is what you can touch and feel is biodiversity. So I want to hear from your perspective. I mean, what are some concrete ways that you can connect those folks who are living and breathing these biodiversity issues and challenges every day to the investors, to the companies, to the corporates, to the folks that are maybe sitting behind their computers most of the day and not seeing firsthand what's happening out there in the real world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle. I think really the key question, because local communities have to be at the heart of the solutions here. Ultimately, we heard from earlier panels, the distinction between E and ESG is all one problem here. Really, it's a big socio-economic problem, right? If we look at indigenous people, they make up 5% of the world's population, but manage land that has more than 80% of the world's biodiversity, right? So they are the stewards of our natural capital, and they're also the ones who suffer the most in ecosystem collapse. So at the moment, quite a few communities are trapped in a negative spiral where poverty or desperation leads to environmental loss, overfishing, illegal logging, which leads to more poverty. And so how do we help stop that spiral is the question. And this is where, Anderson talks a lot about carbon. This is a big angle, carbon markets. And the second thing is regenerative models. So first on carbon, it's very important that besides the usual, conditions of additionality, permanence, no leakage, that local communities benefit the most from carbon projects, more than 50%, we think. And also that they're involved in the decision-making right from the onset, from the pre-development phase, that they have sufficient management rights, property rights. Many studies, decades of conservation work have proven that this is not only the most equitable way, but also the most efficient way to do conservation. Right? If I give an example, a 10-year study in a bird's head seascape in Indonesia showed that fish biomass in marine protected areas that are well managed by local communities are significantly higher than ones which are not, right? And also communities get to keep the upside. So that's, I think, very important for carbon. The second thing is regenerative models, where now we can stop the negative spiral with a body of work from all around the world with lots of scientific research. We now have techniques where we can regenerate the earth rather than degrade it whilst we bring about economic growth, right? So I'm talking about things like regenerative agriculture, where we prioritize soil health, maybe agroforestry in Asia, in Nepal, India. Can we bring that, say, to Indonesia, right? Where 40% of palm is owned by smallholder farmers. Can we have perhaps a multi-strata system where you have palm trees and underneath you have coffee, cocoa, jackfruits, and so on, right? Where you have a lot of social benefits from improved incomes, but also environmental benefits. I'm talking about things like seaweed, for example, where we can farm that offshore in a blue desert where there was no life before and you can bring life there. And many other solutions which are more nascent, so for example, using mangroves as a keystone species, regenerating the desert and then having shrimp and fish production from that. So all of these solutions are key to us. I think it's our job as impact investors to fund the viable models, because a lot of them are still very nascent. And at the moment, they're not ready for institutional investors. So ultimately, impact investors have to lead the way and then hopefully make these scalable solutions, because that's a big problem, right? A lack of bankable projects to invest in. It's not a lack of will, it's not a lack of financial capital, but lack of investable projects. So it's about bringing about those projects.
Well, it certainly helps to hear that detail and those specific examples. I'm sure that's the case that you have to make even for the impact investors is specific projects and successful case studies that can help them kind of visualize where their money is going and how it can make the most impact. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I'm seeing this menacing countdown clock here, but I do want to ask, first, what are each of your biggest fears on this issue? I mean, is it just political intransigence that we know what we need to do, but we're not doing it? Or are there other things that just worry you about how we're tackling biodiversity and investment?
Yeah, if I can kick off, I think the biggest challenge that we face is that we don't have a global goal for nature, right? And we've seen that with the topic of climate change, when the Paris Agreement was consolidated, there was a clear metric and end goal. We want to achieve net zero by 2050. And now, all the different stakeholders are sort of figuring out how to get there by 2050. But at the moment, we don't have that goal for nature. And that's why all eyes are on COP15, happening in December in Canada, where global leaders will come together and we'll really talk about putting together a framework on what type of biodiversity goals we need to achieve globally, right? And the challenge here is that biodiversity is a complex issue. So it's not going to be a CO2 emission metric and we need to reduce that by 2050. It's going to be much more complex than that. So they are talking about like a range of goals that they want to set up, like reversing nature loss by 2030 and having like 30% of conservation on different ecosystems. So if we want to achieve that, it's going to require a wider range of tools for investors as well on how we start measuring the overall, ambitious level of our investee companies to achieve that target. So I think that perfection is actually the enemy of the good. So we should not aim to achieve like a golden standard on how we measure biodiversity. We need to be a bit more creative and flexible around that. And I think the only way to achieve that is if we have that sort of agreement from COP15 and we work together with the companies and with the governments to really find out solutions.
And break it down into smaller goals maybe and move on from there. Yeah, Calvin Anderson?
The political factor is a concern. I think we could have better institutions, better environmental laws, of course, better enforcement and so on. But it's worth focusing on the root cause of biodiversity loss, and that's the food system and land use change. And so for me, that's the worrying part. We still have an incessant rise in the demand for global commodities, whether that's palm oil, rubber, timber here in Asia, or soybeans and cattle in the Amazon, for example. So, how do we manage that when global populations are rising, diets are changing? And that's a discussion worth half an hour alone.
Yeah.
we got to change, I think, diets, eat less meat, which is not regeneratively grazed. We need to, I guess, put price on the negative externalities that industrial agriculture generates, and so on. So many of these angles we have to work towards.
Well, that's a very helpful point because I think that's where it touches on the consumers who we haven't really talked about as much in this conversation.
Yeah, consumer awareness is very important.
It's something where they can see and feel, the impact on biodiversity. Interesting.
Michelle, my biggest fear is short-termism. That people start thinking quarterly, even annually. We see it happening as we speak. I think I saw an article that BlackRock is taking a little bit of a step back on ESG because of the Ukraine-Russia war. So sustainability and biodiversity takes time. It takes commitment, and it takes years and years to implement. And if companies are held in a capital structure that rewards quarterly earnings only, then it's very, very difficult to invest in biodiversity. So my biggest fear is how can we move companies from thinking from quarter to quarter to year and 3 years and 5 year plans. And some of it is regulations, some of it is voluntary market, but a big part of it is consumers. Again, the younger generation, or whoever that's consuming, need to make the right decision. And I hope the regulators can point us the right way. Which are the products that are really sustainable and which are the products that are trying to be sustainable.
yeah, that quarterly, quarterly reporting, we've heard a lot of companies complain about across subjects, but I can see how, yeah, particularly for this one, you get in a trap there. I want to end, we just have a minute or so to go. I want to end on a high note. So instead of now your biggest fear, can you tell us what reasons for hope do you have? And maybe, if you can point to a specific project or a specific geography that kind of gives you a little bit more of a lighthearted outlook on how things will go in this issue.
Yeah, for me, I think it's really what I talked about before, that now we have a financially sustainable way of doing conservation, of protecting nature, right? So it's the carbon markets, it's regenerative models, right? And also, I think we are getting to a stage, where at the precipice of change here, where society increasingly recognizes that net zero is no longer enough. We have to move towards nature positive. And so that's a very good direction we're heading in.
I like that, nature positive. Laura?
I was going to mention the same points, but maybe on top of that, what I think is very positive is to see the overall raise on awareness from the investor community on this topic. Especially in the last couple of years, we've seen initiatives like the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, where more than 100 financial institutions committed to measure the biodiversity footprint of their portfolios. And also now the launch of the Nature Action 100. That's going to be an investor collaborative group really engaging with those companies, 100 companies that have the most negative impact on biodiversity loss. So I think these examples are great to showcase how we can also play a role in sort of trying to find solutions and really nudge our investee companies to implement more sustainable business practices and also, for example, embrace regenerative agriculture as a tool for, those companies in the agricultural sector to mitigate a bit that negative impact on nature.
Great.
Michelle, can I just say something totally off? What I'm excited about and optimistic is this high fossil fuel price would accelerate transition to renewable energy. Right? I mean, oil price is high, coal price is high. I know Indonesia exports coal as well. And everyone's saying, wow, this whole this high fossil fuel price is going to allow CapEx to invest in. Actually, I believe with high fossil fuel price, it's accelerating the transition to renewable energy. Case in point for our company. We started with 1 megawatt of solar panels. 1 megawatt is about 1 hectare of land in actually one of our rooftops in our factory to reduce our coal consumption. The payback in 2019 when we installed it was 11 years. Right now, at the current fossil fuel price, the payback is 6 years. And we expanded it to 25 megawatt. Just overnight, we make a decision. My point being is, being sustainable makes good business. Another case to invest in biodiversity. Investing in biodiversity generates carbon credits, makes good business. So I think if I could take away something is, there are a lot of things that we can do that is sustainable, that is good for biodiversity, and make good money out of it. So I think with that intention in mind, I think we can make the next few years ahead much better.
Well, this is great. It's good to end on a high note. I think we got a lot of stark statistics, and that's ringing in my head, Calvin, what you said about 2% of climate finance being nature-based. So a lot of room for improvement, but thank you all for your fantastic insights, and we hope this conversation continues. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Welcome to the stage, Rebecca Yu, founder of May's Own, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Abby Danzig.
Hello, everyone, and hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being here today with me. Before we get started, I did want to mention that Rebecca's work involves survivors of sex trafficking in the Philippines. We're not going to be discussing graphic details, but we did want to flag this for those of you here with us in Singapore, as well as those watching virtually, as we know this can be a very triggering topic. So Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit more about the mission of May's Own and how you got started on this endeavor?
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. So May's Own is a social enterprise, and we provide livelihood programming and education opportunities for underprivileged children in the Philippines. and more recently in Singapore as well. We work with weavers in the different provinces. We try and get them access to new markets in Singapore. And then we use whatever we earn from that business to buy laptops and connect underprivileged children to education opportunities, whether that's online learning, connecting them with online learning platforms because there's a lack of teachers in the area. So we're just trying to do our best and make sure that, they can continue what they're trying to do.
Absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit more about the artisan piece of it? And you almost have an e-commerce operation going on, I hear.
So, well, in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of different handicrafts. And I really wanted to try and preserve that heritage. A lot of our artisans are elderly or single mothers. Our oldest artisans are around 80 years old now, and our youngest is 16. But it's very difficult for them to go into urban areas and get like a call center job, for example, which is, available in the Philippines. But I feel like I wanted to try and preserve that heritage. I mean, these looms that they use to weave with, they're over 100 years old. And they're not very tech savvy. So this way, we can try and preserve that craft and present it in a more modern way. And use e-commerce to kind of share that with our community here in Singapore.
Fantastic. So your family founded the traditional Chinese medicine company, Yu Yang Sung.
Yes.
And I'm curious how being part of this entrepreneurial legacy has shaped your approach to social impact work.
Actually, our family business started as a social enterprise as well. It was set up to give the tin mine workers health care, because at the time there was none. At the time, a lot of them were addicted to opium. So it in itself was a social enterprise. I think that the concept of philanthropy, of giving back to the community and getting involved, has been in my family for so long. It kind of rubbed off on me. Singapore has changed in that time. And we're very blessed that, I get to go to school, I get to walk home safe. Singapore is a first world country. And it's very beautiful, and I love my country. So I felt that my efforts would be best served somewhere else in Southeast Asia, where opportunities that I have might not be available to the people there.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about, the trip that you took to the Philippines that kind of started it all, and what about that kind of got your mind thinking, hey, I can do something here?
Well, it was kind of by accident. I was in Australia studying international relations, and like most of my college peers, we just wanted to go to Southeast Asia for the summer. Some of them went to Bali, teach English for the summer, and my trip just ended up being a lot longer. I just thought I would try and volunteer, because I felt that when I was in college, we were looking at the data about sex trafficking in Southeast Asia, and I just felt like I didn't quite believe it. I guess being in Singapore, I wasn't exposed to that. And yeah, so I went, and it was
And here we are.
Yeah, and here we are. And it just became like a really long journey.
Yeah.
8 years.
Great. So we're joined here today by an audience of corporate and investment leaders who may be looking to bolster their work around the S in ESG. So I'm curious, what advice would you have for them on embarking on a social impact project? And how do you think that they can best leverage their resources, whether it be financial, manpower, et cetera, and influence to actually make change in these projects?
So I wanted to, I guess with this summit, everyone here already has an intention of doing that, which is great. Something that Anderson spoke about earlier was to have a more long-term plan, which is to be more intentional with what you're trying to do. If you want to make a social impact, environmental impact, I really just ask you to be intentional and sincere with that effort. Don't just put the word sustainability on it. There are tools available. There's B Corp now. You can build a framework about what sustainability means to you, because the beautiful thing about sustainability is that no one really knows what it means anymore, and if you're just going to use it as a marketing term, people will see through that. I mean, I work in social media as well, and I think the younger generation is very, very quick to call out people who make claims that may not be true. So if you have that goal, as a company, as someone in the position of power, whether, you're running a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar business, or simply someone working there who maybe has access to some disposable income that you're willing to part with, think about what you want to do with these resources and how you want to make a difference.
Right. So, as we're sort of talking about, the concept of greenwashing or, just these activities being more marketing than actual results driven, I am curious how you approach this, because you had shared with me when we initially spoke that the majority of survivors that you work with, unfortunately end up back in sex work. I think that this just really speaks to how challenging your work is, and that social impact is a little bit, harder to make progress in. It's not just, controlling what your company does. It's, working with real people. So how do you measure success? And as a kind of a follow-up onto that, companies that are looking to, do this kind of work, there's a lot of increased pressure on everyone to have ESG reporting, data, and metrics available. So how do you think that they should approach this, given that it is sort of a long haul?
It's a long haul, yeah. I think, I recently started to know B Corp set up in Singapore. If you haven't heard of it, I think it's like a really good starting point, because you have to fill out kind of a checklist and try and understand what your constitution as a business does. And that kind of gives you a working framework to really aim for. Again, there isn't a set path. When I started this, I just wanted to teach English for the summer. I didn't plan to do this for so long. For me, I didn't want to just write a check and leave. It's kind of like watching a horror movie. You either get up from your seat and you leave the cinema, or you wait until the whole thing is over and you see some kind of result, right? The hero wins or the ghost gets exorcised, I don't know. But for me, it was really trying to understand what the needs were, and that most of the time, when we talk about survivors of sex trafficking, I don't think people realize, yes, maybe we rescued, let's say 20 girls, right, from a site, but out of those 20 girls, maybe 17, 18 of them will eventually return to sex work. And that's because that's the only community that they've known. These are the only friends that they have. And they're not concerned about, what are the psychological effects of this trauma? They're worried about, what am I eating tonight? The needs are very different, and to understand that takes a lot of time. It helps. I needed time to build my intention and what I was trying to do. So the way that I measure success now is the number of people that want that help, and can I get to them? What can I provide for them? Since COVID started, I had to move back to Singapore, and I haven't been in the Philippines. But we focused on providing online education, and now we have over 400 students. And I'm very proud of that number. It's probably not a very big number. I'm sure many people here have companies that have a lot of employees, but I'm proud of that number because I just didn't think that we would ever get there.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a lot of work. And speaking of this, you had to come back to Singapore. So who are the partners that you're working with on the ground? Obviously you don't drop a check and run, but no. I think it sounds like being part of the local community and being really tapped into what's going on there is a huge piece of success here. So can you talk a little bit about, who are your go-tos on the ground?
Well, I think in social enterprise, we work quite collaboratively. It's not just me that's providing help. It's also the online learning platforms that are saying, okay, let's provide some support. I work collaboratively with the foundations and the shelters. So I approach them, I say, hey, can I focus on your education needs? What does it look like? What can I provide? Do you need printers? Do you need laptops? And I work with other businesses in the Philippines as well. In Singapore, I work with children on the autism spectrum. And so, I'm trying to leverage my network here to maybe get more funding for livelihood programming for the students here. It's just really trying to figure out what can I do with my network? How can we work together? This is very important. I don't need like 50 people working for me because actually it's more of a logistics kind of issue. How do we get the laptops there? So I work with an electronics company that is very involved. They know that I've spent 6 years in the Philippines learning Tagalog and working on the ground, and they believe in me, so they also provide the support.
Right, so you've kind of built that trust
Yeah,
up, which
it's working with
enables
different
success.
parties.
Yeah. Can you share an example of a corporate partnership that has gone right for you? And just give a little bit more background on what were the keys to a successful collaboration? What are you looking for in a partner that you're working with?
Working in the Philippines is difficult, and it's very dangerous. So the electronics company that I work with, it's called Pound It, and they're very intuitive. They know that they have to kind of protect the stock, and they'll make sure that the routes that they take are safe. They make sure that the drivers that they use for the delivery will be trusted with the location of these shelters that are protecting survivors of sex trafficking. It's just having an understanding community that cares about each other, rather than looking at it as okay, this is a corporate partnership, what is the transaction, how much can we get out of this deal? They're very understanding. They will fight for the best deal for me. They'll tell me maybe go with an older model if you don't need that much processing power, because they know that I'm not an IT specialist. And they're really looking out for the needs of my beneficiaries. So they're on my side. Again, like getting to know somebody, it's like dating. Getting to know somebody, going out with them. It takes time to get to know if this is going to work or not. And that's exactly how my partnerships work. I mean, again, like it's been a really long time. It's been 6 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a shared mission is really the key to all of this. I want to pivot a little bit to the role of social media in your life and your work. Because I think
today I'm wearing Max tomorrow.
But I think but you do have a really large network, not just socially but also on social media, and it's sort of opening up a new platform, a new audience to some of these issues that they may not have known about, and you can really shine a lens on that. So, how do you think about your role as an influencer in the social impact work that you do?
I think that for young people, they really, there was a poll recently where these primary school students were asked like, oh, what is your dream career? And like something like 80% of them said is social media influencer.
Wow.
So they really, really idolize social media influencers and content creators. And I know that that's very negative connotation because they're mostly seen as pretty vapid individuals who love to take selfies. So why don't we use this to our advantage? If there are brands out there, beauty brands, fashion brands, lifestyle brands who are willing to put up the money to use my face to sell their products, what are they willing to give me to talk about on their platform? So can I use my platform for good? I think that the media in Singapore I've been interacting with since I was a kid. I mean, I started as like a socialite essentially. So transitioning into social media was quite natural for me. But I went in with the idea that if I'm going to part with my private life and I have to tell people about, the hotel that I'm staying in and like what I'm wearing and who's my makeup artist and things like that, then can I make that work to my advantage? Can I also inject my message? Can I get these young people who want to be social media stars or who follow, all of these different people, can I get them to listen to me? And actually, they've been very receptive. I think young people genuinely care about sustainability and the world around them. I am by no means, a top social media influencer, but I've done my best, and the reception has been quite welcoming. So in that way, I think both sides, like businesses and the audience, have the same goal of helping. And when I tell them about the beneficiaries that I have, they're obviously quite receptive. They want to help. They're, how can we get involved? We've done so many different funding projects, and they've all been quite well received. So in that sense, I'm quite hopeful for the next gen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. I think, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We could have gone on for a couple hours here, I think. But thank you for joining us, and we will be watching the continued success of Maison.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please welcome to the stage Mohammed Umar Swift, CEO of Bursa Malaysia, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Juliet Sully.
We are aware that we're the final panel of the day, and I'm sure you're all wanting to get to lunch, but we also want to be this to be quite an interactive discussion as well. So if you've got questions for Umar, please give them to us, because we would like to have your questions and kind of make this a little bit more interactive as we wrap up. We've got 2 Aussies on stage, or part Aussies, so we probably can talk until 4 o'clock, but that's not the aim of this, so please do send your questions through. But, you know, Umar, when we were having this pre-discussion chat last week, apart from the fact that I was in stitches at the end of it, which doesn't happen often when I chat to CEOs, we were talking a lot about kind of the reset. I mean, a lot of difficult things have happened in the last couple of years, but in terms of transitioning to a green economy, there has been some opportunities too.
Yeah, well, I think there's a call to action. Clearly, the pandemic has focused people's minds. There's a general trend. You've seen the investors lead the charge, and companies are looking for, well, markets, they're looking for customers, and what we've seen is that the pandemic really brought that to the fore. You know, everyone in the room, you lead the charge by how you choose to spend your dollars, and how you choose to spend your dollars influences how, and our friends who are dialing in, of course, as well. Let's not ignore our people dialing in. How people, it's the call to action. The call to action then translates into cheaper capital or access to capital. And what we've seen is it used to be a binary wash, have, don't have. And I think what's been interesting, what we've been seeing is not so much the activism investor, but the conversation that is now taking place. So rather than being a conversation in or out, it is, well, is there an ESG alpha? Can we do more? Let's have that conversation with investee companies and investors. And indeed, all of us as customers and, you know, through our pension funds, we're investors as well, we need to begin to call out and drive the right outcomes.
And how are you having those conversations? Because it is not a cheap pivot to the green economy. I mean, how is Bursa Malaysia helping a lot of Malaysian companies kind of transition here?
I think there's probably 2 elements, if I can, Juliet. I mean, we need to build capacity.
Yeah.
So one piece is regulatory. We start framing the conversation. We begin on a path, very much like my colleagues at SGX, we'll be moving to mandatory disclosure.
Yeah.
Now, I can move, or the team can move to mandatory disclosure. We can tell our PLCs this is where we're heading. But if you don't build capacity as well on that journey, then I think it's not going to succeed. And so we do 2 pieces. One is the regulatory piece. The other piece is building the capacity. There's always resources that's free to use versus sustain. And I think the key piece that when we look at it is, can we build a better ecosystem? In the Malaysian context, if you look at our leading index, FBM KLCI, banks are a large component of that. There will be mandatory disclosure of TCFD. Can banks play a role in providing mechanisms to facilitate that call to action?
When it comes to that regulatory piece, is Bursa Malaysia looking to change or tighten any of those, I guess, guidelines when it comes to reporting the ESG component?
I think there's, previous speakers have talked about alphabet soup and so on. I think there's a subjective element and an objective element. What we're doing is we're very much focusing on the objective element. We're tightening it, if you like. We're raising the bar. What we've seen is very good compliance, but the quality of reporting is not quite where we want it. So we're going to begin to mandate, and we run a public consultation piece, we're finalising the regulatory approvals, and we'll be announcing that we have expectations as to what will need to be disclosed by PLCs. Now, as that happens, we're looking for PLCs to then engage their supply chains and bring everyone along on that piece. So it's not just sectoral. So it is, if you like, it's step up on size of company. And then the other piece is we also don't want to, I mean, bearing in mind, and for most, it's a truism, small to medium enterprises represent 99% of all companies throughout the world. I don't think that's just a generalisation, I think that's true. And we want PLCs to lead that charge, Juliet, and actually help facilitate, if you like, how do, you know, they need to, your ESG, and part of that social piece is to bring that community on that journey.
Well, it brings me to one of the audience questions we have here too, because you were talking about the S part being, of course, sometimes overlooked. But this question here is that S and G seem to be just playing supporting roles for E. So at the end of the day, if it is all about the E, then S deserves more attention on its own. And sorry, I can't read that last part, but G supports both E and S. So your thoughts on that?
Juliet, your eyesight's better than mine.
It is
struggling
a bit small.
little bit.
Can we make it bigger?
If we could, that'd be great. Anyway, no, seriously, we hear a lot about post-COP26. Everything is about E. And it all used to be about G. Actually, I'm all about S.
Okay.
Because if we get the S right, you've got to win hearts and minds. And you know, when people are struggling to put food on the table, environment is going to be a poor cousin, if I may. And that's future state. So in addressing S and getting it right, we're going to make it easier for us to win the environment battle. And I'm afraid governance is just a given. You have to have it. And so, I think there's a piece around environment, carbon emissions, GHG, biodiversity, but we also need to think about how we interact with society and what does it mean. Because a pivot to green is expensive. A pivot to green is expensive in terms of the need to invest in new solutions. But potentially, it's also very disruptive. And we're going to see society change. And therefore, we need to do the right investment in education and so on to facilitate that opportunity. Now, we're aspirational. We want to see that investment in people. So we have whole new economies happening. So it's not traditional economy versus new economy. It is a transition to the new economy.
When it comes to society changing, and this is something that is close to my heart, and I think a lot of women's hearts too, is more about gender diversity. Now, in Malaysia, there is a mandate that from September, large cap companies have to have at least one female on board. This was a mandate that came through last year, and then smaller cap companies, I believe, from June next year. How are you seeing that transition? Has it been an easy move for listed companies?
I think, well, there's a couple of elements. No, it hasn't been as easy as we would like it to be, and hence it's become mandated. Because it used to be a step-up requirement. So now we need to encourage the pool, build capacity, and I think it is breaking through the glass ceiling, if I may, Juliet. Once there's I hate to admit it, there's a gender bias on the boards. If you just look, we've got approximately 30% compliance on the large PLCs. We need to get it better. And a part of that is we've also changed the rules around the definition of independent non-executive director in Malaysia. So at the moment, we've made it a hard stop at 12 years, at 9 years. You need to seek approval for extension, secondary two-layer voting, and that's going to drive that change because we're not driving the cadre of eligible male directors down, but we're forcing that change and rejuvenation of boards and having that conversation while working with the 30% club, building that capacity, bringing people in and saying, well, here are some really good people that look at things differently from the way you look at it. So it's no longer a boys' club.
And when it comes to the boys' club or the girls' club trying to fight that, I mean, you can't be what you can't see. And there are a lot of, I guess, networking events where men are not present. That needs to change too, because you need to infiltrate. So how can somebody like you in your position and your role help be a mentor here?
What I endeavour to do is sponsor.
Yeah.
Race, creed, colour, we're not concerned.
Yeah.
We reach out to events, and what we try and do is actually introduce new people to new things, be it the nature of the business. Traditional businesses are biased in one direction. We'll introduce new people to it. We'll have events. We curate events, very much like today is curated. We'll endeavour to create something to get the right outcome, if I may. Julie.
All right, let's go to the questions that we are getting from the audience, and excuse my eyesight because it is a bit difficult to read some of these. But this one from Ken Hickson has got quite a few votes. So how is the built environment responsible for 40% of global emissions? Oh, here we go. Addressing embodied carbon and emissions energy use in construction and operation of buildings. Is that something you can answer?
Not really.
Not really. I don't know if that one could be for you.
This is a very specific
This might have been
question.
one for a previous audience. If we can just...
I think the key thing is when we're looking at global emissions, and I'll pivot the question if I may with apologies to Ken, is, in a Malaysian context, our biggest challenge is actually electricity and transportation. And I think the key thing is, as we look at new technologies, is how to fund it.
Yeah.
And what is the role of developed markets to support emerging markets? Now, that's a shameless plug, as I've taken Ken's question and moved it in the direction I want to go.
Well, let's get back to what we were talking about in terms of some of the supply chains too. And I guess the biggest piece and everything that we're talking about at the moment is inflation. Now, inflation perhaps in ASEAN not as dire as what you're seeing in the likes of the US and Europe, but we've seen food inflation. And you mentioned there, if you can't get dinner on the table, then the last thing you're worried about is, the environment piece. But we saw food protectionism earlier in the year from Malaysia too. How do you see all that kind of playing out? And is that a concern that we should be having in ASEAN?
Now, I think, well, if I may, policy, we've seen the issues around palm oil. It's disruptive to market. We support free markets, if I may, Juliet. I think the key thing is, as we try and manage, we have a number of different... Inflation's been relatively benign in the Malaysian context, but there's also been a lot of conversation around subsidies and can it be afforded, and hence you end up with these policy decisions. I think what we need to do is, as we move forward, we have government is looking for more progressive subsidies. This will address your food disruption problems, but we do need to build better.
And how do we do that?
Well, in essence, one is to raise living standards. That's a statement everybody wants, but more importantly, I think subsidies need to be more progressive and be targeted rather than global. If they're a blanket subsidy, it's very inefficient and very expensive.
Very expensive indeed. All right. So we're looking here too at some of the other questions. I like this one. Are you looking at the same one as me, the third one across? ESG is mostly BS. We don't need to spell out what BS means. Nature doesn't care how we measure companies. Biodiversity protection is critical to human health, COVID a case in point. How can companies embed nature-based solutions faster?
Very good question. I sort of alluded to it. I think, biodiversity is the poor cousin to CO2. But they're equally important.
Yeah.
And I think so. It's about greenwashing. It is about transparency. But there's a need to have a conversation, Juliet, about what we want and what. And this gets back to all of us in the room and investors, making it very clear we're not just looking for a target. We're looking for outcomes. And what is the outcome we're seeking to achieve? So it's building that capacity. It's building understanding. So, the conversation, ESG is mostly BS, okay? I think the reality is, I'm not going to challenge that conversation because we have alphabet soup. It is whatever you want it to be. And so we need to drive a common standard, we need to have a conversation, and we need to be serious about what we're doing with it. And so then you can, one would hope to change Raphael's mind a little bit because ESG is, biodiversity is a subset of ESG. And if you don't Unfortunately, you've got to make it pay.
Yeah.
And so it is not just enough, and this is perhaps wearing my sort of accountant's hat. If I cannot make a business case for it, and I'm making a long-term sustainable business case, we only have one world and we need to protect it. But in the same regard, biodiversity is a part of that.
Does that come back, though, to setting more targets then? I mean, we know that a lot of surveyed banks have this net zero target for 2050. That includes financed emissions. We talked there about some of the regulations that are needed. But how, I guess, do you put more of these in place so that it does become something that the boardroom is discussing right off the bat?
Well, at the moment, in a Malaysian context, you have to have that conversation already as a PLC. What we want is, now that that conversation is happening, and we have large construction players that are actually adopting ESG, they even, I won't mention the company involved, but they calculate carbon tax and actually charge each other as a conglomerate. Now, I think what we need to do is, in embedding it, again, it gets back to that I always come back to that theme. What is it society wants? And the private sector cannot replace government, but it can augment and support.
Yeah.
And so as government, for example, mandating board representation, can actually drive that change, and then the private sector will facilitate it.
I'm so sorry, I'm trying to look at both you and the board at the same time, but it is quite difficult to read some of these. So we've touched on those a couple, and I'm not sure whether that one is specific to you.
No, we've done that. S&G supporting, we've done that. Vote, anonymous.
We've touched on that. Sorry. Can you just minimise it again? It's just hard to I'm trying to read them, but also at the same time.
First column.
I think we've kicked off a lot of those.
Second question.
Well, I might put on my Bloomberg hat and ask you a couple of questions that we wanted to hear, because we spoke to you on Bloomberg TV a couple of months ago, and you indicated that there's quite a lot of liquidity, demand for IPOs improving. Tell us what you're seeing in terms of the pipeline there.
Pipeline's strong.
Yeah.
We had an IPO yesterday, it's up. And it's thematic, well, it's not thematic, it's what resonates with investors. But, I mean, quite clearly, for those that you track average daily value, it has come off a bit. That's systemic. People are long on cash at the moment, but what they do is they're looking at IPOs as an opportunity. And as long as it resonates, we have good support. So the lead stream is very strong, Juliet, going forward. I'm very happy with that, and we're working very hard to bring those companies. Now, of course, headwind, inflation, does it impact their profitability? Is it still the right time to go to market? But indications are to our lead stream. I think when we chatted earlier in the year, I was talking about 37 to 40. I'm still confident.
Okay. And are you seeing strong demand across a range of sectors, or are there new companies coming to market?
Well, we've seen medical come up. Not your traditional, it's more of technology being applied to medical. We've also seen that pivot to green, if you like. A green technology is also well supported. But it's construction, the listings have got away, but post-listing, it's traded relatively flat. So I think people are looking for growth. I mean, so why do we invest? We invest for growth, we invest for dividend. And so does the company's pitch, its story resonate? How are they applying the capital? If those resonate and tick the boxes, you'll have interest. And what we're seeing is certain companies really resonate, particularly with retail investors. I mean, you have your institutional investor as your bottom line, that they provide the bedrock. But if you like, we always talk about healthy speculation, but really what we want to see is retail investors engaged. And at the exchange, we've been working very hard to have conversations about companies, raise awareness, get people thinking about what they can do with it. Do you invest through a mutual fund? Do you invest through your pension plan? Or do you directly invest?
Yeah. We're also looking in terms of the overall global economy. We touched then on the inflation piece, but there are a lot of recessionary concerns. Here in Asia, as you said, it is a little bit different in terms of the overall climate, and we're very much focusing as well on the reopening theme, which is going to be a big boon to the likes of Malaysia. How, I guess, optimistic are you about where we'll be sitting in 12 months' time?
That's an imponderable. I wouldn't be the CEO of the exchange if I had a really good view on that. But I'm not going to dodge the question. I think the key piece when we're looking at is what's going to happen in this. Does the recession become self-fulfilling, Julia?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, that's another interesting point.
That's the theme.
Well, we've seen on our Bloomberg trackers as well, the amount of times recession has been mentioned in news articles spiking. Is, as to your point, is that then just, self-fulfill these prophecies?
Yeah, I mean, do we increase interest rates to a point that we tackle inflation but stifle the economy?
Yeah.
Now, that's a big question. That's a macro question. That's beyond my pay grade. We deal with it. Now, what we're looking to do is you want to manage inflation. Then you have the impact if you don't increase your interest rate on your foreign exchange. Where are you sitting vis-a-vis your trading partners? Now, so recession is not good for the region, Julia, because we are trading nations. And so it will impact us. So it is imported back, if you like. So it's not imported inflation, it'll be imported recession because, we are blessed with strong domestic consumption, but it is fed by trading.
Okay, let's go back to some of these other questions here. I think some of them are becoming a bit more relevant to you now. How do you manage your third-party risk management as part of your sustainable plan? That's from Yvonne, I think.
Oh yes, how do you manage a third-party risk management? It gets back to looking at, that piece when I was talking about TCFDs.
Yeah.
No, so when we look at it, and one is the Bursa lens. Bursa, we're an exchange. We can see who we're trading with and working through that piece. But we're looking for banks as they calculate their TCFDs I want to see a common, we would like to, we would like to see a common language. This is what we aspire to. With this common language, ideally we should have one model for calculating TCFD. So we mandate large corporations have to disclose. Banks are large corporations. Banks will then need to collect data. They have many touch points. You want that touch point to be common. So you want we envisage a solution where customers self-populate the data set once, and then it goes to all the banks who need it. And it would also come to us at the exchange. If you have mandatory disclosure requirements, it will go through BursaLink and then be available. This is our aspiration for it. And that's a conversation. So in managing third party, it's about facilitating it. Because, pardon me, the key to remember is it costs money. And for smaller corporations, for small partnerships, that's capital they probably don't have. So we have an obligation under the S to actually facilitate it.
But how do you, have that conversation that, yes, it costs money now, that, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this panel, this is something, the transition is costly, but down the track, this is going to pay off dividends?
Okay, the conversation, we focus on PLCs, if I may. FTSE for Good, we have roughly about 80 odd at the moment. We have 950 PLCs, so less than 10% are in that index. Now it's got different trading, it's got trading matrix on it as well. Doesn't mean it's only those companies that have good behaviour. Now, the pushback from the board is why? And we need to give the answer to that. And the answer to that is competitive advantage, access to market, and it is an investment in the future. So you may invest, for example, if you're a manufacturing concern, you would build capacity, you'd buy a machine. This is not fundamentally different. It's an intangible asset. And that investment allows you to differentiate yourself from your competitors. If you're an early adopter, take advantage of supply chain disruption, insert yourself in a green supply chain, build new markets. And that's a conversation that we're having domestically, not just with PLCs, but also with SMEs, that this is an opportunity for them. It's not a threat.
I know you said that if you had a crystal ball, you'd probably be, well, I'm paraphrasing, but you'd probably be on an island at the moment and not on stage with me here. But in terms of just looking ahead, when we're having these conversations and we are investing in a more sustainable future, in 5 to 10 years' time, how confident are you that the world is going to look incredibly different?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Ukraine-Russia war, tragedy.
Yeah.
No two ways about it. But we've seen, the need for energy, coal plants being refired up. It's regressive in the short term. But it's such a call to action because what happens is new technologies are expensive. Because of energy prices going up, we're now in a position to invest in new technology. And as you invest in new technology and it becomes more ubiquitous, the price of that solution goes down. So I'm expecting actually positive outcomes as we look forward.
All right, I think if we have a look, if there's any more audience questions, but we're 40 seconds away from time, and I do like to pride myself on finishing panels on time. Well, that's a good one there, just a quick one. The world slowed down in 2020. It was good for E. Is that the only viable solution?
No, I think we can build back better. I mean, you don't have to stop trading. We don't have to go back to Stone Age to look after our environment. We embrace new technology. We drive with new technology. I mean, getting back to the last point I just made.
All right, great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to Juliet and Mohammed, and thank you to all of our speakers and moderators from throughout today. I also want to give a big thank you to the Bloomberg Live team and to all of the event team here who's made this a success for this. So let's give them a round of applause for all of their hard work. Thank you all so much for that. I also want to thank again our sponsors for today's event who made today possible. Our founding sponsor is DBS Bank, and our presenting sponsor is RGE. Thank you so much to both of them for supporting today. You can give them a round of applause as well. We've got a couple of great upcoming events, so hopefully we'll see you again either in person or joining us virtually. Here in Singapore on August 4th, we'll be hosting the Bloomberg Asia Wealth Summit, so that's next week. Hopefully we'll see you again next Thursday. September 13th, we'll be hosting the Intelligent Automation Creating the Workforce of the Future event. So hopefully we'll see you at one or both of those. We'll also be continuing the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit series in New York on December 7th, so maybe we'll see you there virtually or in person as well. So we're going to be seeing you right outside of this, right after this for lunch. Join us right outside for lunch. If you pre-registered for the Accelerating Net Zero private lunch, that's actually going to be over here to the right, so out these doors to the right. Otherwise, just join us outside for the lunch. We'd love to see you there. And then at 1 o'clock, we're going to be doing a facilitated networking session. So you can see these three faces on the screen behind me and to the sides here are each going to be running facilitated networking groups. So if you want to talk about adaptation and resilience, look for Michelle. Clean transport, look for Abby, and gender equality, look for Anna. We'll have some conversations with each of those groups. You can talk to people who are interested in the same topics as you. That's it. Thank you all again so much for being part of the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. It's great to see you all here. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.